Hello, my dear friends. You know, when we picture medieval times, we often see these ladies in their richly draped skirts, but underneath all that glamour were kitchens just filled with ash and burnt grease and smoke that was thick enough to suffocate you. The women's hands were covered in blisters from stirring these massive cast iron pots with heavy wooden spoons. Their clothes always had this musty smell, and they had to knead bread with their bare hands on these wet wooden countertops. There were no mixers, no pre-packaged foods, no exhaust fans, and certainly no clean running water. It all started with a dull knife and just a bundle of hay to get a fire going.
Tonight, I want you to step into their kitchens with me to discover this whole world of survival that was hidden behind every single meal. So, before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I'm doing here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always so fascinating to see who's joining us from all over the world. Now go ahead and dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background noise, and let's start this journey together tonight. If you were to walk into a medieval home during mealtime, the very first thing you'd notice wouldn't be the food, but the smoke. It was thick, grey, and it was constant. It filled up the air until every single breath you took carried the taste of ash. In the middle of the main room, a small fire would be burning right on the floor, surrounded by stones that were blackened from years and years of soot. There wasn't a chimney to guide the smoke out. It just rose slowly, clinging to the wooden beams, seeping into the walls, into your hair, into the very fabric of your clothes. The smell of wood and cooking fat never really left the house, no matter how many times the floor was swept or the door was opened to stir the air. This was the kitchen, the very heart of the home, even though it looked more like the inside of a furnace. The women worked right up close to the flames, crouched down low, with their eyes half closed from the heat and the constant sting. The fire was made every morning with dry straw and a handful of charcoal saved from the night before. They'd blow gently through hollow reeds, trying to coax the tiny sparks to life until the flames finally started to catch. Once the wood was burning properly, it had to be fed with careful attention because the fire could just vanish in an instant if it was left alone. There was no gas knob to turn, no switch to control anything. It was this constant negotiation between the woman and the flame. It's almost comical to imagine someone today trying to boil a pot of soup by sitting in a cloud of smoke until their eyes watered and their lungs burned. And yet, that was the daily reality of cooking back then. The floor was just dirt, the walls were dark, and the air was so thick that visitors could barely see across the room. A big iron pot hung from a chain that was fixed to the rafters, and it would swing gently right above the fire. Inside of it, stews made of meat, grains, and herbs would just simmer for hours on end. The smoke seasoned everything with this bitter edge, a flavor that became so common that people didn't even notice it anymore. The cooking fire did more than just prepare food, you see. It was the only source of warmth for the family during the winter, the place where stories were told and tools were mended. But it was also a slow poison. Years of breathing in that smoke scarred the lungs and made voices dull and raspy. Coughs were common, and so were watery eyes and raw throats. Even the little children crawling near the fire grew up with soot on their faces and inside their nostrils. The women who spent the most time tending to the pot often lost their sense of smell completely. The light from the fire was the only light in many homes. When the sun went down, its glow would cast these shadows across the low ceiling, flickering like restless ghosts. Sparks would jump out unexpectedly, landing on the hems of dresses or in strands of hair. Burns were a common thing and mostly ignored, with small scars forming these patterns of daily survival. The floor right under the hearth was hard and cracked from years of intense heat. Sometimes the fire would spread quietly, crawling into the straw mats or a pile of dry wood. Many homes were lost not to war or famine, but to a single, careless spark. The smell of cooking couldn't be contained. It clung to everything and everyone, signaling to any passing neighbors what kind of meal was being made. Meat, when they could afford it, sizzled with fat that dripped and hissed right into the flames. Most days, though, the pot just held a thin broth with some vegetables, bits of barley, and wild greens. The smoke turned these humble meals into something that felt warm and complete, even when there wasn't much flavor, especially when you compare it to our modern kitchens filled with stainless steel timers and extractor fans. The medieval hearth seems almost prehistoric, like trying to cook inside a volcano that's disguised as a home. But for these women, it was an act of care. Every spark they tended, every log they adjusted was part of keeping their family alive. The act was both intimate and absolutely exhausting. It demanded endurance and a kind of intuition. They learned to read the smoke, to sense the fire's hunger, to feed it just enough to keep it alive, but not so much that it would consume the pot. When the meal was finally done, there was no clean way to finish up. The pot stayed black. The floor turned grey, and ash gathered in the corners like uninvited guests. Water had to be carried from wells or streams just to rinse the pot. But even then, the soot never really went away. Every surface in the home carried that same dull film of black. Clothes smelled of it, hair carried it, and even dreams seemed to hold its presence. I find something so haunting about how normal it must have become to live inside that haze, to just accept a life where every single breath was borrowed from the very fire that kept you fed. This balance between comfort and suffocation really defined their daily existence. To cook meant to breathe smoke. To nourish meant to endure the slow burn of your own lungs. There was no separation between home and hazard. There was only the understanding that survival required it. The air inside these homes would have been heavy, the temperature shifting wildly with every gust of wind that got in through the cracks in the walls. Women often had to kneel or crouch for hours, adjusting logs, stirring, and just waiting. Their faces would shine with sweat mixed with soot, creating these streaks that marked both their effort and their fatigue. In those moments, they weren't thinking about comfort. They were thinking about keeping the pot from tipping over, about saving enough firewood for the evening, about feeding their children before the light disappeared completely. The fire had its own will. It demanded obedience. It refused to burn evenly, and it refused to wait. A sudden draft could make it roar to life or die completely. A damp log could turn the smoke into pure suffocation. Every woman who cooked learned through pain and patience that control was just an illusion. The fire ruled the house just as much as the Lord ruled the land, and just like any ruler, it punished mistakes swiftly. By night, when the flames were finally allowed to rest, the room would still glow faintly from the embers. The air was quiet, though it was never clean. Smoke lingered even in sleep, caught in blankets and in dreams. Morning meant starting all over again, rekindling that same ritual of smoke, heat, and endurance. It wasn't a choice, but the very rhythm of survival itself. The image of these women working in that thick haze just lingers in history, like the scent of burnt wood. They built their meals in discomfort, they fed their families through fire, and they accepted danger as a part of their daily life. The hearth was both their kitchen and their curse, a symbol of warmth that demanded constant sacrifice. They cooked in darkness and breathed their own smoke, and still they managed to create comfort out of all that chaos. And as the fire dimmed each night, They probably believed the hardest part of the day was over. They were wrong. Because even after the fire died, the poison of the smoke remained, trapped in their homes, in their lungs, and in their quiet sleep. The hearth gave warmth, and it took health in equal measure. It was the silent center of their world, glowing beneath layers of soot and memory. Yet this was only one piece of their struggle. What came after the cooking was done revealed another kind of hardship, one that waited quietly right beside the dying fire. The iron cauldron was the center of every medieval kitchen, a dark, heavy thing that seemed to outlast the very people who used it. It hung from a thick chain right above the open fire, its sides blackened by years of smoke and fat. Inside, stews and broth simmered slowly, never quite reaching a full boil, never quite cooling down. The heat was so uneven, rising and fading with the whims of the flames. Every single meal was a test of patience, of how long you could endure the heat, the smoke, and the weight of time just pressing down as the cauldron muttered softly over the fire. These pots were built to endure, not to make life any easier. Each one was made of solid iron, rough and unyielding, so heavy that it would take two people to lift it when it was full. When the fire underneath it grew too strong, the stew would bubble violently, splattering hot fat onto their arms and faces. The burns were common, and the pain was just ignored. The women who cooked learned to move around the fire like dancers, knowing that every wrong step would cost them a piece of their skin. They stirred with long wooden paddles, trying to keep their distance, but there was no real safety. The steam rose up, thick and wet, fogging their faces and leaving their skin feeling raw. It's almost absurd to think that these women were performing the work of modern machines with nothing more than their patience, muscle, and instinct. There was no dial to control the temperature, no timer to remind them when a meal was done. They just watched the stew, listened to the sound of the bubbling fat, and trusted their senses. The smell of meat and herbs mingled with the smoke until the entire house became one endless scent of fire and food. The cauldron was used for more than just cooking. It was also a symbol of survival. Into it went whatever they could find or afford: bones, barley, roots, or scraps of dried fish. Everything mixed together in that same dark broth that would feed a family for days. There was no luxury of clean separation, no fine dishes or delicate flavors. It was simply nourishment, nothing more. But even that was uncertain because the uneven heat meant that parts of the stew would burn while other parts stayed completely raw. The pot itself bore the marks of this struggle, a crust of black soot inside and out that was impossible to scrub away. The weight of that cauldron defined the rhythm of the day. It was lowered and raised with so much care, using hooks that squealed as they turned on their hinges. A single slip could spill boiling stew all over the floor, scalding whoever was standing too close. There were no gloves, no aprons thick enough to stop the heat. Bare hands met hot metal every single day. When you compare it to today's kitchens filled with sleek appliances, the medieval hearth seems like a battlefield, one fought against iron, flame, and time itself. When the meal was finished, there was no easy way to move the pot. It just stayed there, above the coals, until the fire died, keeping the food warm, or at least no colder than the room around it. The family would gather around, dipping their bowls directly into the pot. Sometimes ashes or little bits of charcoal would fall in, unnoticed or just ignored. The first taste was always of smoke. For many people, that taste became the flavor of home. As night came, the cauldron was left hanging there, heavy and silent, its surface glistening faintly with a film of oil. The women would clean up around it, sweeping away the ashes, knowing that by morning the exact same routine would begin all over again. It was both a comfort and a burden, a tool that demanded labor without any rest. Children grew up beneath its shadow, learning how to feed the fire, how to stir without spilling, how to endure the heat without complaint. The iron itself almost seemed alive. It moaned when it was heated, popped when it cooled, and sweated rust when it was left damp. To own a cauldron was to have a companion that would outlive you. Families passed them down through generations, each one getting heavier with more soot and more memories. The food cooked inside was never pure, but it was always shared, and that's what made it precious. I can almost imagine the stillness that filled the room when the fire finally settled and the cauldron stopped moving. The quiet relief of a day's work being over and the lingering scent of smoke that just refused to leave. Those moments of silence were always brief. Tomorrow would bring the same slow boiling, the same burns, the same endurance. Cooking in those cauldrons wasn't a craft, it was survival, shaped by iron. Every meal carried a risk with it. Boiling water splashed unpredictably. And when it did, the only cure was some cold air and a rag. There were no ointments or soothing creams, only scars that healed badly and became a part of their skin. And yet these women didn't stop. They stirred again and again, because hunger was always worse than pain. The uneven heat made every pot unpredictable. Sometimes the stew would thicken up too fast. Sometimes it refused to cook at all. They learned to listen to the pot, to trust the rhythm of its sound. When it hissed too sharply, they knew it was burning. When it went quiet, they knew the fire was dying. It was a conversation of sorts, though it was one that punished every single mistake. At times, the air inside the room would shimmer with heat, and sweat would run down their backs until their clothes stuck right to their skin. The iron cauldron glowed faintly in the firelight, like a heart beating in the dark. The fire underneath flickered against its surface, painting the walls in a restless orange. And through it all, they just waited, as patient as the food, transforming so slowly, as if time itself was being cooked. The simplicity of that scene hides its cruelty. The cauldron gave life and pain in equal measure. It demanded time, effort, and strength for every single spoonful of food it produced. When families ate, they tasted not only the stew, but also the labor of the women who stirred it into existence. The iron pot was both a tool and a tyrant, holding warmth only for those who served it faithfully. That heavy pot ruled their days and their nights. It was never clean, never cold, and never silent. The meals it provided were hard-earned and smoky, carrying the memory of the hands that bore the burns to make them. The iron cauldron taught endurance better than any sermon. It reminded them daily that survival was never gentle, that warmth demanded pain, and that comfort was a rare reward in a world built on labor. The cauldron gave them food, but it took away their peace. It filled their homes with heat, their lungs with smoke, and their arms with scars that would fade only to return again. Yet, despite all the hardship, they continued because fire and iron were the only constants they had. The image of that dark pot swinging above a stubborn flame lingers like the echo of a heartbeat in that smoke-filled room. It fed life, one day at a time. But it also whispered that even the simplest act of cooking could turn dangerous in an instant. The iron pot was their companion, their burden, and their quiet enemy. And once the meal was done, another battle began. The struggle to light the fire all over again before hunger returned. The meal never really ended in a medieval home. Once the pot was empty and the fire was reduced to ash, the thought of the next meal would begin immediately. The hearth that had glowed so warmly just an hour before now sat dark and lifeless, waiting for the hands that would coax it back to life. Without the comfort of a modern stove, every single meal required the same ritual of starting from nothing. The ashes had to be stirred, dry straw had to be gathered, and the faintest spark had to be persuaded into a flame. It wasn't a simple act, but a quiet negotiation with the elements, one that was repeated several times each day. The work was always slower than hunger. When the fire died, food couldn't just be reheated with a button or a switch. The remains of a stew or a loaf of bread had to be eaten cold, or you had to start all over again from the very first step. Morning fires were especially cruel, as the air was still frozen from the night. Women would crouch on the ground, blowing through reeds to try and awaken the sleeping embers. The smoke would bite at their eyes, and the damp air seemed to mock every attempt. The wood was never dry enough, the wind was never still enough, and the stomach was never patient enough. It's both tragic and absurd that half of the time they spent cooking was really just spent convincing fire to exist. Each spark was uncertain, each success temporary. When the fire finally did catch, its glow brought more relief than celebration. It meant warmth, and warmth meant life. But even then, the process was delicate. One careless breath could scatter the flame. A single drop of moisture could kill it. They kept bundles of kindling stored inside the house, hidden away from the rain. The smell of wood followed them everywhere. Every night they would check the embers before sleeping, burying them under ashes to preserve the faintest trace of heat for the morning. Sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't. There was no guarantee, only habit. The smallest mistake meant hours of extra labor the next day. The idea of convenience, of simply warming up leftovers, would have felt like a complete fantasy. Without the ability to reheat, nothing was ever wasted, but nothing lasted either. Meals were planned around the lifespan of the fire itself. Once it died, everything cooled down with it. Bread became hard, stew turned solid, and fat congealed like wax. The only option was to eat what was there or wait for the next fire to be built. When you compare it to today, it would be like trying to make breakfast each morning by striking stones together until they agreed to spark, just to toast a single slice of bread. Cold food just became normal, even acceptable. Leftovers weren't a luxury, but a discomfort that was quietly endured. Families ate in silence, chewing on what just hours ago had been warm and fragrant. There was no complaint because there was no alternative. Warmth was a privilege that was just too costly to repeat for every meal. The wood that fed the fire also fed the fear of running out. Firewood was a kind of currency gathered from forests or purchased at markets. It took hours to chop, to dry, and to stack. Women often collected small branches while the men worked in the fields. Every log burned too quickly, every spark demanded more. The effort to keep her home fed was not just in the cooking, but in the endless preparation that came before it. They were already thinking about the next fire, even while they were eating from the current one. This sound of a fire starting was a part of their lives, the crackle of straw, the sharp hiss of damp wood, the deep breath drawn just before the first flame appeared. There was a satisfaction in those moments, but there was also exhaustion. The smoke would crawl up their sleeves and into their hair. Children would watch their mothers crouch and blow until the flame finally obeyed. And when it did, the room would come alive again, bathed in orange and shadow. I find it strangely moving that something as simple as relighting a fire could hold so much meaning. It was the difference between a home filled with warmth and a room filled with cold silence. Each successful fire was a small victory over the damp, the dark, and the hunger that was pressing at the door. But these victories were always short-lived. Fires consumed wood faster than it could be gathered. In the winter, damp logs would hiss uselessly, sending up smoke without any heat. The effort doubled as the results were cut in half. The women, already tired from other chores, just learned to accept it as routine. They would wake up before dawn, not to cook, but to wake the fire itself. Their days began in smoke and ended in ash. In some homes, a single ember was carried from one place to another inside small clay pots. Neighbors would share a flame when one household failed to light its own. The fire was more than just warmth. It was connection. Something borrowed and passed along like trust itself. Losing the flame meant isolation. Without it, even the simplest meal became impossible. The repetition of it all dulled the imagination. Each day looked the same. Gather, blow, wait, and feed. The air smelled of effort, the walls of smoke. Fire was both an enemy and an ally, an ungrateful companion that demanded endless attention. It punished neglect, but it rewarded persistence. Those who mastered it earned nothing more than the right to start all over again the next morning. The act of rekindling a fire shaped their very sense of time. It reminded them that warmth was never guaranteed. It had to be earned every single day through labor and care. There was something almost sacred about it, though not in the way of a ritual or a prayer. It was the worship of necessity, the praise of survival. Evenings were quieter once the fire burned out. The room would cool quickly, the silence feeling heavy. The absence of the flame felt like the absence of life itself. Shadows would creep back onto the walls, and the faint scent of ash clung to the air. They would sleep near the hearth, hoping that the faintest ember would still be there when morning came. When one fire failed to return, they built another. When that one faded, they started again. The act never ended because neither did hunger. In those endless repetitions, they found a rhythm, a purpose, and exhaustion all at once. The fire gave light, warmth, and food, but only if it was constantly served. It had no memory, no gratitude. It demanded to be courted anew every few hours, as if each meal were the first and the last. They relit the fire not just to cook, but to remind themselves that they still could. The smallest spark in the ashes meant hope. And in that hope, they built another meal, another day, another breath inside the endless smoke of their lives. The sight of them kneeling before the ashes, their faces lit by the first flicker of orange, feels like a symbol of their entire world. To live meant to begin again, no matter how many times the fire died. The flame was fragile and so were they, but somehow both kept returning, again and again, until habit became faith and survival became routine. The daily struggle to restart the fire revealed a truth that few dared to question. Comfort could vanish as easily as smoke. And while the fire burned, something else awaited in silence. The cost of keeping that fragile warmth alive through the long, hungry nights. Preserving food was a battle against time itself. Without the cold safety of a refrigerator, every piece of meat and every fish began to rot the moment it was cut. Women learned quickly that the only defense was salt, sun, and smoke. In the dim kitchens of medieval homes, slabs of meat were rubbed with handfuls of coarse salt until their surfaces turned white and stiff. The salt bit into their fingers, but it was the only thing that could stop the stench of decay. The meat was then hung above the hearth, where the smoke rose day and night, curling around it like a slow shroud. The longer it hung there, the darker it became, its surface coated in soot and grease. The same thing happened with fish. The smaller ones were laid out under the sun, their silver skin turning dull as the hours passed. Flies would gather despite the effort to wave them away. The larger fish were hung by their tails near the fire, where the smoke seeped into the flesh until it hardened like leather. What was once fresh and full of life became dark, dry, and brittle. It could last for weeks, sometimes even months, but it no longer tasted like food. It's almost amusing that what people today would consider spoiled would have been a luxury back then. The smell of preserved food was harsh and thick. The air carried salt, smoke, and the faint rot of what had been delayed for too long. Every house had its own version of this scent, a mixture that no amount of washing could ever remove. The smoke that saved their food also coated it with a bitterness. The first bite of any meal was always sharp, always dry. Still, the families ate in silence, grateful for something that wouldn't kill them with hunger. Fish, drying in the open, became a part of the landscape. Along riverbanks and on rooftops, rows of them hung motionless in the air, their tails curled from the heat. Birds would circle overhead, just waiting for their chance. The women checked on them daily, turning them, brushing away insects, and hoping the weather wouldn't change. A single storm could ruin everything. There was no other way to store food for the winter. No secret method or hidden cellar. What couldn't be salted or dried was doomed to vanish. When you compare it to the quiet hum of a modern refrigerator, the medieval methods feel almost brutal. A life where safety depended on salt crystals and fire instead of quiet convenience. Every single grain of salt was precious. It was bought at markets like treasure, measured with trembling fingers. Some people even reused it, scraping it from the surface of cured meat to use again. The result was a taste so strong that it burned the tongue, but it was still better than starving. The process consumed entire days. The meat had to be turned, the salt reapplied, and the smoke had to be adjusted to keep the flies away. The heat made it unbearable to stay near the fire for long, but leaving it unattended meant losing everything. When the meat was finally ready, it was packed into cloth or wrapped in animal hide and stored up in the rafters. The air up there was warmer, drier, and thick with dust. Food prepared this way was hard to chew and salty to the point of pain. Water had to be boiled to soak it before eating. Even then, the texture stayed rough. The taste burned the mouth. And yet, there was a pride in having something to eat when others were going hungry. The preserved food was a promise that tomorrow would not be empty. Children grew up watching their mothers lift the heavy strips of meat, testing their dryness just by touch. They learned by memory, not by recipe. Too dry and the food would turn to ash when it was cooked. Too damp and mold would spread silently overnight. The balance between the two was an art, passed from one pair of hands to another. The work was lonely. The women moved between smoke and sunlight, always chasing that line between preservation and decay. Their arms ached from holding salt bags, their eyes stung from the smoke, and their backs bent as they carried wood to keep the fire alive. Still, they continued. The salt stung their open cuts, but there was no stopping. Food was survival, and survival left no room for comfort. I think there's something quietly admirable in that stubborn devotion, the refusal to give up against nature's constant decay. They didn't have machines or cold storage, but they had a willpower that was hardened by hunger. Each piece of salted meat hanging above the fire was proof of their endurance, not their abundance. Sometimes, despite all their efforts, the food spoiled anyway. The smell of failure would fill the room before the eye could even see it. Mold would creep along the edges, turning the surface green and soft. When that happened, the food was thrown away, and the family went hungry for days. Every mistake carried a cost, and every success felt temporary. The act of preserving food was more than just work. It was resistance against time, against weather, against death. They learned to accept that flavor didn't matter as long as the food stayed edible. Meals were judged not by their taste, but by how long they lasted. Salted meat was too sharp, dried fish was too tough, and yet they were miracles in their own right. Each time they rubbed salt into flesh, they were fighting the invisible hand of decay. Each wisp of smoke that curled around the meat was like a prayer for another day of safety. When the last rays of sunlight faded and the fish still hung there intact, it felt like a victory. Not a grand one, not celebrated, but enough to breathe a little easier through another cold night. Food preservation became a rhythm, one that was tied to the pulse of the seasons. When summer brought heat, they worked faster. When winter froze the air, they leaned on what they had stored. Their lives turned with the sun, the salt, and the smoke, as predictable as hunger itself. The taste of those meals lingered long after the plates were empty. It was the taste of survival, of salt and bitterness, and of unspoken gratitude. What the fire cooked, the salt preserved, and the smoke disguised became the foundation of medieval life. The air in those homes carried both life and death, mingled into one steady breath. Every bite reminded them that survival came with a price. The body endured, but the senses learned to accept discomfort as normal. The sight of those salted meats swaying gently in the rising smoke spoke of both pride and exhaustion. It was proof that they had beaten time, at least for now. But for every meal saved this way, another challenge was waiting in the shadows, one that no amount of salt could keep from spoiling. Cooking over an open flame was a constant trial of control against chaos. The heat came not from a steady source, but from whatever the fire decided to give. The flames danced without any rhythm, sometimes roaring high, sometimes collapsing into dull embers. Every pot, every pan, every single meal depended on the mood of the wind. When a gust slipped through the cracks in the walls, the fire would leap up suddenly, scorching the bottom of the pot and leaving the top completely untouched. What should have been a slow stew turned bitter and black, while the upper layers remained pale and raw. The women who cooked learned to expect failure as often as success. There was no knob to twist, no steady hum of power to hold the temperature still. Fire was unpredictable, a living thing that demanded obedience. The smallest breeze could turn calm cooking into a complete disaster. Each time a meal burned, smoke would fill the air, stinging eyes and throats, reminding them that mastery over fire was only ever an illusion. It's strangely ironic that the very thing meant to feed the family could so easily become the reason for their hunger. Meals were a delicate gamble. The women stood close, turning the pots, shifting the logs, adjusting the stones to change the heat. They did it all by instinct, guided by sound and smell alone. A hiss meant too much moisture. A sudden silence meant the fire was fading. When the flames shot too high, they had to pull the pot away with their bare hands, using a cloth that was already singed from earlier attempts. The fire left its mark not just on the food, but on their skin. Red patches, blisters, and scars that never faded. The struggle wasn't just against the flame, but against time. Every single moment demanded their attention. They couldn't walk away, not even for a heartbeat. If they did, the meal would burn before they returned. To cook meant to watch endlessly, to endure the heat on their faces and the ache in their backs. There was no rest in this kind of kitchen, only waiting for the next flare or fall of the flame. If you compare it to modern kitchens where a temperature dial keeps food perfectly even, the medieval hearth would look like chaos made domestic, an unpredictable beast that was fed by hands that never stopped moving. The fire's heat didn't spread evenly. One side of the pot would boil violently while the other stayed cold. Bread baked near the edge would come out half charred, half dough. There was no perfection, only persistence. Every dish carried the taste of struggle, a hint of ash, a memory of how close it came to ruin. To the women, this unpredictability just became normal. They stopped aiming for precision and learned instead to adapt. When meat burned, they scraped away the blackened layer and stirred the rest into the broth. When porridge curdled, they thinned it with water and pretended it was meant to be that way. Every failure was repurposed, every mistake was absorbed into survival. There was no waste because there couldn't be. The smell of burning wood mixed with boiling fat filled the air each day. Sometimes the fire burned too fiercely, forcing them to open the doors just to let the heat escape. Other times it smoldered weakly, leaving the smoke so thick it would make their eyes water. There was no middle ground. The women's faces shone with sweat as they leaned in close, squinting through the haze to guess whether the stew was cooking or dying. Their clothes carried the scent of the fire everywhere they went. It seeped into the fabric and skin until warmth and smoke became indistinguishable. Each evening, when the cooking was over, their arms would tremble from stirring the heavy pots. Yet the fatigue was forgotten when the family gathered to eat. It didn't matter if the food was uneven, if half was burnt and half was underdone. What mattered was that there was food at all. I find it quietly admirable that they accepted imperfection not as a failure but as a part of life itself. They didn't demand precision, they sought sustenance. Every unevenly cooked meal was still a victory over hunger. Their patience built a kind of wisdom that no recipe could ever teach, one that understood survival was more important than taste. The sound of crackling logs became the rhythm of their days. They learned to read the fire like a language. When the wood hissed, it was damp. When it popped, it was too dry. They added twigs, shifted coals, and fanned the flame with their apron. The movement was endless, repetitive, and necessary. Behind every meal was an invisible performance, one that demanded endurance more than skill. Wind, too, was a cruel companion. It would sneak in through gaps in the walls and roofs, laughing as it ruined their careful work. The same wind that cooled their sweat also turned their food to ash. There was no protection from it. Even the best cooks couldn't fight the air. Some tried to build barriers from stones or clay, but the results were always temporary. The wind always found its way in, and the meal always carried its trace. When the fire behaved, the kitchen felt alive. The warmth reached their hands, the smell turned rich, and for a moment it seemed like the world was kind, but it never lasted. One shift of air, one forgotten log, and the entire meal could collapse into smoke and bitterness. Cooking in that age meant surrendering to uncertainty. It was less about creating flavor and more about managing disaster. They cooked not with control, but with a faith that the flame would cooperate long enough for them to finish. Sometimes it did, and sometimes it didn't. In the silence after every meal, they would stare at the blackened pots, knowing the next day would bring the same challenge. The fire would test them again, the wind would tease them again, and they would endure it all again. Every uneven dish, every singed edge, every burnt smell told the story of a resilience that was hidden in the heart of daily life. Food in those days tasted not of luxury, but of survival. It was imperfect, but it was theirs. The fire flickered, uncertain as ever, and the women stayed near it, waiting for the moment to stir, to turn, to save what could still be saved. And in that endless cycle of watching and adjusting, they turned chaos into routine, and routine into life. The flicker of the flame that refused to obey taught them more than recipes ever could. It reminded them that control was an illusion, that warmth came only through endurance, and that survival was never still. The uneven heat was their teacher and their tormentor, shaping every meal into a reflection of the world they lived in, one ruled by chance, by weather, and by the fragile balance between effort and loss. The smell of smoke lingered long after the meal was done. The taste of fire stayed on their tongues, a constant reminder that every comfort they had was borrowed from the flame. And when the fire finally dimmed, they were left wondering what other invisible forces of their world might betray them just as easily as the wind betrayed their cooking. The air inside a medieval kitchen was never clean. It carried the weight of every meal ever cooked, every fire ever lit. The smoke clung to the walls, darkening them until even daylight seemed to be tinted grey. When the women moved through it, the air followed them, curling around their hair and sinking deep into their clothes. It was absolutely impossible to escape. Cooking didn't just feed the family, it marked the body itself. Every meal left behind a scent that refused to fade, a reminder that warmth and filth were inseparable. After each meal, the room would fill with a damp heaviness. The fire that had burned so brightly just moments ago now smouldered weakly, sending up these lazy ribbons of smoke that drifted through the air like ghosts. The women's hair caught the smell first, absorbing the mixture of ash and fat. By the end of the day, it was impossible to tell where the fire ended and the person began. Their skin would shine faintly from oil, their sleeves stiff with residue. It's almost absurd that the same act that fed their families also made them smell like the kitchen itself. They had no hoods to draw the smoke away, no machines to clear the air. The windows were small, built to keep out the cold, not to let air in. When the smoke grew too thick, they'd open the doors briefly, letting the wind sweep through and carry out only a fraction of what lingered. Most of it just stayed. It seeped into the fabric, the wood, and even their dreams. The smell of burning wood and fat was the scent of home, as ordinary as taking a breath. The hair was the worst part. It absorbed everything. Washing it was rare, too time-consuming, and just too cold. Instead, the women would tie it up beneath cloths, hoping to trap the smell inside. It never really worked. When they untied their scarves at night, the smoke would escape like something alive. When you compare it to today's kitchens, where steam is pulled silently away by shining metal vents, their world would seem like living inside the exhaust of a fire that never ends. Their clothes suffered the same fate. The fibers grew stiff with grease. Even after washing them in cold water, the stains remained. The fabric held the memory of each meal, the stew that boiled for too long, the bread that burned, the dripping fat that fell into the fire and hissed. Every stain told a story, and no amount of scrubbing could ever erase it. They didn't own many garments, so they wore them again and again, each one carrying the scent of labor. Washing itself was another burden. Without hot water, the cold stung their hands until the skin cracked. They would rub lye soap against the fabric, rinse it in basins, and watch the grey water swirl away. But when the clothes dried, they still smelled faintly of smoke. The scent was just too deep, too permanent. In time, even their bed sheets, curtains, and hair coverings took on the same odour. The entire home breathed as if it were made of fire. Men returning from the fields would recognize the smell of dinner before they even stepped through the door. The smoke met them like an old companion. It coated everything they owned, furniture, blankets, even the children's toys. Nothing escaped. Some families grew so used to it that they couldn't smell it anymore. To outsiders, it was suffocating, but to them, it was simply the smell of life continuing. I find it strangely moving that this smell, so heavy and unpleasant to us now, was once a sign of care and devotion, It meant that someone had tended the fire, stirred the pot, and endured the smoke to bring warmth to the household. It wasn't perfume, but it was love disguised in the scent of soot and sweat. The constant exposure to smoke left its mark on their skin. Their faces grew dry, their lips cracked, and their eyes reddened. The thin oil from the cooking fire settled over them like a second skin. Washing helped a little, but water couldn't undo what the air had already done. Some women would mix animal fat into their skin to keep it from breaking, replacing one layer of grease with another. The cycle was endless: fire to smoke, smoke to skin, and skin to ash again. Even their voices carried traces of it. The air they breathed scraped their throats raw. The constant coughing, the raspy laughter shared between the women while cooking became part of the rhythm of their days. They joked about it, though their smiles were hidden behind the smoke. The soot became a silent witness to everything: the meals, the arguments, the exhaustion. When visitors entered the home, they noticed the smell first, then the darkness. It would wrap around them before they could even speak. Some would politely praise the meal, others would cough into their sleeves, but the women of the house no longer noticed. Their world was made of this smoke. To them, it was invisible, familiar, even comforting. At night, the smoke would settle low to the ground, clinging to the sleeping bodies. It found its way into their lungs, into the folds of their blankets. The air never cleared completely. The morning always began with the same heaviness, the same smell, the same unspoken understanding that life here could not be separated from fire. Even in moments of stillness, the scent persisted. When the fire went out, the walls would exhale it back into the room. The scent of cooking was never really gone. It merely slept, waiting to return. The women would brush the ash from their sleeves, tie their hair up again, and begin another day in the same haze. It wasn't filth to them. It was their identity. The smoke on their skin said they belonged to a home that was alive, a place where warmth and survival came hand in hand. They carried that scent everywhere they went, into the market, into the church, into every corner of their world. It was the perfume of endurance, the signature of a life lived close to the fire. The air that filled their lungs wasn't clean, but it was theirs. Every breath was a mixture of effort and survival, the taste of heat and labor bound together. It told them that as long as there was smoke, there was still something cooking, something living, something worth enduring another day for. The smoke never left them. It was a companion, a mark, a quiet shadow of everything they had built. And yet, for all its persistence, it was fragile, a breath of air, gone too easily if the fire ever failed. The homes smelled of labor. The women carried its evidence, and the world outside never understood that what looked like dirt was, in truth, a devotion that burned quietly every single day. The scent of the hearth defined who they were. It clung to them like a memory, both a comfort and a curse. And as they stirred the air heavy with smoke, they couldn't have known that the same air that was keeping them alive was also slowly consuming them from within. Grinding ingredients in a medieval kitchen was work that demanded silence, patience, and pain. There was no machine to ease the effort, no metal blade spinning at your command. Instead, there was a stone mortar, heavy and cold, and a wooden pestle that fit the hand like a burden you learned too young. Each strike echoed through the small room, a dull rhythm that could last for hours. The sound wasn't loud, but it was steady, like the heartbeat of daily survival. Inside the mortar lay grains, seeds, or dried roots, stubborn things that refused to break easily. The work began before dawn. Women would sit on the floor or on low stools, their backs bent, their arms moving in repetition. the pestle rose and fell without a pause. The air was filled with a fine dust from crushed herbs and ground barley. Sweat mixed with the powder until both clung to the skin, creating a thin film that tasted of salt and earth. Their shoulders ached, their wrists throbbed. And yet they continued. Grinding wasn't simply cooking, it was the slow transformation of strength into nourishment. Every kitchen had its own mortar, passed down and worn smooth by generations. Some were small, made for spices. Others were so large they needed 2 hands to lift. Over time, cracks would form along the stone, filled with the dust of countless meals. Nothing was ever perfectly clean. The flavors of the past lingered faintly, mixing with the present. It's almost darkly funny that their recipes carried traces of every meal ever made, simply because the mortar refused to forget. The ingredients fought back. Hard seeds would bounce away. Coarse grains refused to soften enough to make flour fine enough for bread. The pounding had to continue long after the arms began to tremble. The noise became a kind of background music in the village, every home pulsing with the same rhythm of survival. From morning until evening, the women beat against the stubbornness of nature, turning it, grain by grain, into something edible. Dust rose into the air with each strike, settling on their hair, eyelashes, and lips. It made them cough softly, but they didn't stop. There was a strange peace in the repetition. The movement required no thought, only endurance. The body learned to do it even when the mind wandered elsewhere. Pain became a companion, not an enemy. When you compare it to the modern whirring of electric grinders that finish the same task in seconds, the medieval method feels like a ritual of endurance, a conversation between stone and willpower. Each bowl of flour or powder was a small victory, measured in blisters and fatigue. They knew no other way, and maybe that's why they never complained. Complaints didn't make the seed any softer or the pestle any lighter. Some women learned to grind by sound. They could tell when the grains were ready just by the tone of the impact, the way the pestle struck the stone with a softer echo. Their muscles developed a strength that looked invisible until they stopped. The moment they paused, the ache would return, creeping into their fingers and shoulders. There was no escaping it, only living with it. Grinding was more than work. It was memory. The rhythmic sound tied together generations of women. Mothers taught their daughters, and daughters taught theirs. The motion stayed the same even as the faces changed. To grind meant to keep tradition alive. It meant feeding the family with an effort that couldn't be measured by time or comfort. The stone mortar sat at the heart of the kitchen. Its surface was darkened by age and touch. When it wasn't in use, it rested like an idol, silent but heavy with purpose. Every mark on its surface was a trace of survival. No one ever thought to replace it. It was too valuable, too constant. In a world where everything broke or decayed, the mortar remained. I can almost feel the exhaustion that must have seeped into their bones, the quiet acceptance that pain was just a part of nourishment. To grind was to earn every single meal through the labor of the body. It blurred the line between hunger and relief, between suffering and care. Some days the air itself felt tired, the steady pounding mixed with the crackle of the fire and the murmur of voices outside. Hours would pass unnoticed. The work consumed everything, thoughts, time, and energy. The grains turned slowly into powder, but the body aged faster than the food disappeared. When the work was done, there was no applause, no rest. The meal still needed to be cooked. The fire still needed to be fed. The women would wipe their arms with a cloth streaked white with flour, their hands red from the friction. The ground mixture was poured carefully into pots or bowls. The air briefly filled with a faint scent of roasted seeds. Then without a pause they began again. The mortar and pestle wore away over time, their edges smoothing, their shape softening, just like the hands that used them. Some mortars broke after decades of use, splitting cleanly down the middle. When that happened, the family mourned it quietly. It was like losing an old friend who had known every meal, every struggle. Grinding wasn't considered special. It was simply a part of living, an act done so often that it disappeared into the background of existence. And yet within that endless repetition was a quiet heroism, the kind that never asked to be noticed. Every handful of flour represented hours of invisible labor, each one a testament to an endurance disguised as routine. The sound of the pestle striking the stone became the heartbeat of the household. Even in their sleep, they could hear it faintly in their minds, as if the motion had carved itself into their memory. There was no glory in it, no joy, but also no despair, only necessity. The rhythm of grinding filled every corner of their world. It was the sound of hunger being turned into hope, of exhaustion being turned into sustenance. The mortar was a simple tool, but it demanded everything: strength, time, and the quiet surrender of comfort. The sight of the women hunched over the mortar, their hair falling loose, their hands white with dust, says more about their world than any tale of kings or wars. They were the silent engine that kept life moving, one grain at a time. And as the sun fell and the last echo of the pestle faded into stillness, they would sit for a moment in the silence that followed, a silence that carried both relief and the knowledge that tomorrow the same sound would begin again. The mortar rested in its corner, heavy with dust and memory. It had done its part, and so had they. But beyond the quiet walls, another task waited, one that demanded more than just strength. It required an endurance of the cold itself. In a medieval home, warmth was never guaranteed, even in something as simple as water. Every task, whether it was washing vegetables, cooking porridge, or cleaning your hands, began with cold liquid drawn from a well or a stream. The water would bite at your skin, a reminder that nature gave nothing freely. To make it usable, it had to be heated one pot at a time over the same open fire that cooked their meals. The process seemed endless. By the time one pot was warm, another needed filling. The rhythm of daily life was measured not by hours, but by how long it took the water to boil. They carried buckets that were heavy enough to strain their arms, their wooden handles slick with moisture. Each trip outside brought back water that was darker than they hoped, speckled with dirt or bits of leaf. It had to be strained through a cloth before it could be heated. The fire would hiss as drops fell into it, the sound a soft protest against the cold water meeting the flame. It feels almost cruel that something as gentle as warmth could require such harsh labor. There was no luxury of taps or pipes. Water didn't just flow, it had to be fetched, poured, and coaxed into usefulness. When it was time to bathe, the entire process stretched into hours. A pot of hot water was precious and brief. The moment it left the fire, it began to cool. Families would take turns using it, beginning with the eldest and ending with the children, and by that time it was no longer warm. Some would try to reheat it, but in the time that took, the fire would consume another handful of wood. If you compare it to the simplicity of turning a faucet today, their world would seem like a lesson in patience, where comfort was earned only through constant repetition. In winter, the effort doubled. The air would freeze before the steam could even rise. Water cooled faster than their hands could use it. Every breath carried a fog of exhaustion. Even the fire seemed reluctant, as if protesting the endless demand. The women would hover over it, waiting, watching the bubbles form, and then vanish before their eyes. The heat never lasted. Once it was poured into bowls or basins, the warmth would flee, stolen by the cold stone floors and the drafty air. Washing clothes became a battle against time. If the water cooled too quickly, the grease wouldn't lift. If it boiled for too long, too much of it would evaporate to be useful. Every task carried this balance between too much and too little. The margin for rest simply did not exist. They heated water not only for cooking, but for cleaning, for treating wounds, and for tending to children's fevers. The pot became a symbol of hope, a promise that something could be softened, soothed, or made bearable. And yet the very act of heating it left burns, cracked hands, and smoke-choked lungs. The irony was cruel. To find warmth, they had to endure fire. The smell of boiling water mixed with smoke and wood, turning the air thick and heavy. The women would lean in close, their faces flushed red from the heat. Drops of condensation would form on their foreheads and fall into the pot, joining the water they had labored to fetch. I find something quietly heroic in that repetition. How they faced the same cold every single morning, knowing it would defeat them again by nightfall. Yet they fought it anyway. Water was life, but it was also a thief of strength. The buckets grew heavier as the years passed, the stairs steeper, the fire harder to start. There was no rest from it. The smallest household task demanded boiling water, and every drop seemed to cool faster than the last. When the children complained of the chill, the mothers would smile faintly, knowing that warmth was just too expensive to waste on comfort. The winter months were the worst. The wells would freeze, forcing families to break the ice before they could draw water. Their hands would turn numb before the buckets were even filled. Inside, the fire had to work twice as hard, and still, the steam that rose from the pot would disappear into the cold air like a fading breath. The women would sit near the hearth, holding their hands over the pot for warmth, knowing it wouldn't last. The act of boiling water became a meditation on persistence. It required attention, endurance, and acceptance. They would wait in silence, listening to the faint rattle of the pot lid, the low hum of the flame beneath. When the first bubbles appeared, it felt like a victory, a brief, fleeting success before the next demand. They never wasted a single drop. The same water used for washing vegetables might later be used to clean dishes or soak laundry. Nothing was pure, but everything was used. Life in those homes was a circle of steam and ash, of cooling and reheating. Each act of boiling carried within it the memory of all the ones that came before. The air inside the house shimmered faintly from the heat, but just beyond the walls, the frost waited patiently. They knew that no matter how much they boiled, the cold would always return. Still, they kept doing it. There was a quiet defiance in the act, an insistence that warmth, even if it was temporary, was worth the struggle. When the day ended, the pot would sit cooling in the dark, its surface reflecting the dying glow of the fire. The water inside had long since lost its heat. But the faint mist that hung above it spoke of effort, of labor that was turned into comfort for just a few brief moments. The next morning, it would begin again. New water, new fire, new smoke. The endless routine of turning cold into warmth, knowing that neither would ever last. The sound of water boiling became a part of the rhythm of the house. It was the sound of resistance, of people who were too stubborn to surrender to the cold. In every drop that steamed away, there was proof of their endurance. The water cooled, the fire faded, and still they stayed, tending the embers. The world around them was cold, indifferent, and vast. But as long as they could make water boil, they still had control over something, even if it was only for a little while. The faint hiss of steam filled the air like a sigh, soft and fleeting. It carried the warmth of effort, the weight of repetition, and the quiet truth that survival is rarely clean or easy. Each pot that was boiled was a victory. Each cooling bowl was a reminder that the warmth they fought for would always be temporary. And as the last wisp of steam vanished into the dim rafters, they began to wonder how many more times they would have to chase the same fleeting heat before the season finally turned kind again. Washing was not an act of cleanliness in the medieval home. It was a battle against filth that never truly ended. Without sinks or running water, every bit of washing from vegetables to dishes began with a bucket filled at the nearest well. The water was cold, always cold, even in the height of summer. In the winter, it burned the hands with its chill. Women would kneel beside wooden basins, their fingers already raw from the air, and plunge them into the water that was clouded with dirt. The surface would ripple brown before it ever even touched what needed cleaning. The effort was endless, and the results were rarely satisfying. The basins themselves were old and lined with a residue from years of use. Bits of food and grease clung to their sides. The wood absorbed everything, oil, moisture, and the faint rot of time. No matter how often they were rinsed, the smell lingered. Each basin had its own history of meals washed and washed again until the water turned grey. It's almost absurd that the very tools that were meant for cleaning were themselves impossible to keep clean. Vegetables came from the ground, heavy with mud. Carrots, leeks, and turnips carried the earth with them, and it took long minutes of soaking just to free them. The women would swirl their hands through the water, rubbing the dirt from the roots, scraping the grit from the stems. Each movement numbed their fingers further. The water would darken quickly, forcing them to change it again and again. Every refill meant another trip outside, another bucket, another reminder of how far comfort stood from their reach. Washing dishes was no easier. The wooden bowls and spoons trapped grease in every single grain. There was no soap as we know it now, only ashes mixed with water or sand that was rubbed by hand. The mixture scoured, but it never truly cleaned. Grease lingered as a dull film on the surface. When the light hit it just right, the sheen would betray their effort. They didn't stop, though. Clean enough was all that mattered. If you compare it to the gleaming surfaces of modern kitchens, their washing place would look more like a workshop for endurance than hygiene, a place where pain, not convenience, polished the dishes. The cold made their hands tremble, but there was no escaping it. They couldn't wait for warmth because the family needed to eat again soon. Water was drawn, poured, used, and replaced in a rhythm that matched the rhythm of breathing. Constant, repetitive, necessary. The smell of old water filled the air. Bits of vegetable skin and breadcrumbs would float in the basin. When the work was done, the ground beneath was damp, the floor was cold, and their sleeves were soaked up to the elbows. They would squeeze their fingers to try and bring the feeling back, sometimes rubbing them against their aprons until the blood returned. The skin would crack along their knuckles, forming small cuts that stung when they were touched by salt or soap. And yet they continued day after day because a dirty bowl meant shame, and shame was heavier than fatigue. The buckets were heavy, carved from wood, and bound with metal rings that rusted in the damp air. They would creak when they were lifted, sloshing water across the ground. Sometimes the handle would split, spilling everything and forcing another trip to the well. The journey itself was a part of the labour. The path was uneven, the air was sharp, and the water would slosh against the sides like it wanted to escape. Inside the home, the act of washing never brought freshness. The air stayed thick with the smell of wet wood and smoke. When they finished, the cleaned vegetables were still cool to the touch, and the dishes were still faintly greasy. Perfection wasn't expected. clean was a word that just meant good enough to use again. It was the same for their hands, raw and reddened, which they would wipe dry on coarse cloths before returning to the fire. I find something deeply human in that quiet acceptance, the way they understood that true cleanliness was never possible, only the appearance of it. Their work wasn't about removing dirt, but about keeping it from taking over entirely. It was a fragile balance between effort and decay, between the will to stay clean and the certainty of becoming dirty again by evening. Water was reused until it couldn't be used anymore. The first rinse might wash vegetables, the second would clean the dishes, and the third was poured onto the floor to settle the dust. There was no waste because every single drop was earned with labor. When the last bucket was empty, the room would fall quiet except for the dripping of their sleeves and the creaking of wet wood drying by the fire. The hands that washed also bore the proof of their labor. The skin thickened with calluses, yet the cracks never healed. Sometimes an infection would set in, turning their fingertips dark and sore. There were no remedies beyond wrapping the wounds in a cloth and continuing the next day. Pain was constant, but it became a background noise, as ordinary as the sound of water being poured. Children learned early to help. They would fetch water, scrub the smaller bowls, and carry away the dirty basins. The work taught them the same lessons their mothers knew, that life was repetition, and repetition was survival. The house never stayed clean for long, and that truth was simply accepted. The scent of wet wood and cold water followed them everywhere. It clung to their skin just as the smoke from the hearth did. To live meant to carry the smell of one's labor, a scent that marked who worked and who didn't. No perfume could disguise it, and no one tried. It wasn't shameful. It was life. At night, the basins were turned upside down to dry, but even then they wept quietly. Drops of water would gather beneath them, forming small puddles that reflected the dim glow of the dying fire. The sound was faint but constant, like the last whisper of the day's exhaustion. Morning would come, and the same tools would be waiting in the same places, ready for the same work. Nothing ever changed except the weather and the water's temperature. The effort stayed the same, as reliable and as heavy as the buckets themselves. The act of washing, repeated endlessly, wasn't about purity. It was about holding decay at arm's length, just long enough to eat, to sleep, and to start again. The women who washed those basins didn't dream of ease. They dreamed of warmth, of hands that didn't ache, of water that didn't sting. But in the world they knew, dreams were as fragile as the thin layer of frost that covered the bucket each dawn. The wooden basins and the icy water shaped their lives as much as the food they prepared. They were both tools and trials, symbols of the kind of strength that never asks for recognition. And as they wiped the last bowl dry, their fingers trembling in the cold, they could already feel the weight of tomorrow's buckets waiting by the door. In the kitchens of the medieval world, even the simplest task carried danger. Cutting meat or vegetables was never clean or quick. The knives were made of iron, dark and rough, their edges dulled by years of use. Every blade carried small patches of rust, the color of dried blood. Women held them carefully, knowing how easily they could betray the hand that fed them. The handles were splintered, the balance was uneven. Still they were used every single day because there was nothing else. Each slice was an act of trust between flesh and metal. Before the meal could begin, the knives had to be sharpened by hand. A stone served as the only tool for this task, rubbed slowly against the blade until sparks would jump faintly in the dim light. The sound was dry and steady, a reminder of how fragile their instruments were. But no matter how long they worked, the knives never stayed sharp for long. Iron dulled quickly, as though it was resisting its purpose. It's almost ironic that the tools meant to make life easier demanded so much work just to stay barely functional. The process of cutting was more like tearing than slicing. Meat would cling stubbornly to the blade, its fibers stretching apart instead of separating cleanly. Vegetables would crush under the pressure, releasing juice that stained the board and the hands. Each motion required strength and care, but fatigue made both unreliable. When the knife slipped, it did not forgive. The thin edge, blunted but still cruel, would tear into fingers as easily as it tore into food. Blood mixed with the meal more often than anyone ever admitted. The wooden boards they cut on were no safer. They were scarred with deep grooves, each one a memory of another meal, another accident. Rust from the blades would seep into the wood, coloring it in dark streaks. The smell of iron and old meat never left. No one thought to wash the boards thoroughly. Water would only warp the wood further. Instead, they were just wiped with rags and reused, carrying traces of everything that came before. If you compare them to the shining, spotless blades of modern kitchens, their knives would seem more like relics from a battlefield, dull, dangerous, and soaked in history. And yet those crude tools shaped every meal, every survival. The women who used them learned the language of their imperfections. They knew exactly how to angle their wrist to coax a cut, how to twist the blade to separate sinew from bone, how to pause when the metal caught against the grain. Each act of cooking was part caution, part courage. The knives would rust overnight if they were left near the damp air. Every morning they were wiped with oil or fat to keep the metal alive a little bit longer. The smell of iron mixed with the smoke from the fire created a scent that clung to their fingers. Sometimes the blades would break altogether. When that happened, they were repaired with wire or hammered straight again on a stone floor. No knife was ever truly new. They were all survivors of too many meals. The weight of those knives made fine work impossible. Cutting bread produced uneven chunks. Hacking at bones sent splinters flying, and slicing vegetables turned them into pulp. But in that imperfection, the meal still came together. Rough edges didn't matter when hunger was constant. No one expected beauty from food, only enough to fill the stomach. The danger of slipping was always there. The iron blades were unsteady, the grips worn smooth by sweat. The women's hands bore tiny scars like constellations, proof of countless slips. Cuts were washed in salt water or just ignored entirely. Infection was common, but life left little time for healing. A hand that was bandaged with a cloth still had to cook, to clean, to lift. The world didn't pause for pain. I can almost imagine the sound of that blade struggling through a piece of meat, the scrape of dull iron, the quiet breath held just before it finally gives way. It must have been a sound that was both satisfying and weary. A small victory in a day that was filled with struggle. Those moments defined the rhythm of their life. Effort followed by resistance, resistance followed by endurance. They mended their tools like they mended their lives, imperfectly, but enough to continue. The sharpening stones wore down until they cracked, and they were replaced by whatever smooth rock could be found nearby. Some women learned to sharpen their knives by feeling rather than sight. Their fingertips would trace the blade's edge to guess its readiness. It was a dangerous habit, but that habit was the only skill they could rely on. When they cooked, their motions were slow and deliberate. A single mistake could end more than just a meal. Blood wasn't unusual in their kitchens. It was part of the routine. A small nick here, a deeper cut there. Each one was treated with rags or ashes. Pain was constant, yet it was invisible beneath the repetition of the work. The meal had to be finished no matter the cost. The iron knives were more than just tools. They were companions of hardship, their imperfections reflecting the lives of the hands that held them. They dulled easily, rusted quickly, and hurt often. And yet they endured just as their owners did. Both were shaped by necessity rather than care, and both carried the marks of survival. Rust would gather along the edges, creeping like decay. It would stain the food faintly red, adding a metallic taste that everyone recognized but ignored. They said it was the taste of the kitchen, the flavor of their lives. Clean steel was something they imagined, something belonging to people who never knew real hunger. By evening, when the knives were laid aside, their edges would catch the last light of the fire. There was a tired glow flickering across metal that had seen too much use. The women would wipe the blades once more, their fingers careful, their eyes half closed from the day's exhaustion. Tomorrow the same knives would cut again, duller, heavier, and yet somehow still enough. In those small acts, sharpening, slicing, bleeding, enduring, lies the entire rhythm of survival. The knives could never be trusted, but neither could they be spared. They were as necessary as fire, as dangerous as the world itself. The dull iron taught them patience, precision, and pain. It demanded respect through injury, obedience through fear, and gratitude through endurance. Each meal that was carved with those blades was both an achievement and a warning. Proof that even survival could draw blood. The rusted knives rested beside the fire, waiting for another day's use. Their silence was deceptive, hiding the memory of every wound they had caused. The women knew that the next cut could just as easily be their own, and as they cleaned their hands in the cold water, they couldn't help but wonder how much longer they could keep feeding their families with blades that hurt them as much as they helped. There was no clean, flat surface in a medieval kitchen. The place where food was cut wasn't a spotless board, but the same wooden table that was used for eating, sewing, and working. Its surface was rough, lined with grooves and scars that had gathered over years of chopping and hammering. Every single mark was a reminder of a meal once made, of a blade that was once struck too hard. Bits of meat and fat hid deep in those cracks, turning black with age. The smell never truly left. Even when the table looked clean, it was alive with what lingered inside it. When meat was laid on the wood, blood would run into the lines like ink into paper. The surface absorbed it instantly, darkening around the edges. After the cutting was done, the same hands that had handled the knife would wipe the table with a rag that was already stiff from grease. The gesture was more of a habit than a cleaning. It's almost darkly comical that their idea of hygiene was little more than a weary swipe of an oily cloth. The rag removed what was visible, but what had sunk into the wood stayed there, a quiet infection that no one could see. Some families used slabs of stone instead, thinking it was cleaner. But the stone would crack too, especially under the heat. Fat and blood would find their way into those fractures, mixing with dust until the entire surface smelled faintly of rot. The smell became a part of the air, a part of the home. No one questioned it. It was the scent of food, of work, of living. When the women began to prepare the day's meal, they would pour a little water over the table, just enough to soften what had dried. Then they would scrub with grass or straw whatever they could find until the surface looked lighter. The water would turn red or brown, and the floor beneath would grow sticky. The table would gleam faintly afterward, not from cleanliness, but from the layer of oil that was left behind. It was the same thing every day. Nothing was ever truly washed, only reused. If you compare it to the white cutting boards of modern kitchens, those medieval tables would look more like relics from a butcher's stall than a part of a home. They weren't just places of work, but living archives of decay. Every meal layered new stains on top of old ones. Every wash simply rearranged the dirt. And yet, those tables fed families, held their bread, and bore their candles. They were filthy and sacred all at once. The surface itself felt rough to the touch, its fibers raised from years of moisture and heat. When knives struck it, small splinters would break loose, sometimes embedding themselves into the food. The taste of wood was as familiar as the taste of salt. The women learned to scrape the table gently, just enough to prepare the next meal without adding more damage. The wood resisted, but it never broke. It was as stubborn as the lives that were built around it. Flies would gather quickly, drawn by the smell of meat and milk. The women would wave them away while they were cutting, but they always returned. Cats would prowl near the corners, waiting for scraps. The kitchen was alive in every sense, moving, breathing, filled with tiny, unseen life. The notion of sterility didn't exist. If an illness came, no one blamed the table. Sickness was fate, not hygiene. When they cooked fish, the smell would linger for days. When they butchered an animal, the blood would soak in until even hot water couldn't remove it. The edges of the table were darker than the middle, a halo of stains that grew deeper each year. And yet, no one replaced it. To do so would have felt like discarding a part of the family. The table wasn't only where food was made, but where hands rested, prayers were whispered, and the tired leaned while waiting for bread to rise. I find it unsettling and strangely touching that the same table where they cut meat was also the one where their children learned to write, or where they would lay their heads to sleep. It speaks of a life without any separation between labor and living, where every surface carries both comfort and contamination. Sometimes, when the cutting was done, they would sprinkle ash across the surface, believing it would absorb the grease. The grey dust would spread over the stains like snow on old ground. It dulled the shine but masked the smell, at least for a while. Then the same hands would brush it away and set out bread for the evening meal. The table was ready again, always ready. The idea of cleaning wasn't about removing dirt, but about keeping it from overwhelming the senses.
As long as the smell stayed bearable, as long as the stains didn't crawl with life, it was enough. The wood would creak beneath the knife. The stone would chip beneath the weight. But both of them endured. They were silent witnesses to the unending repetition of survival. The light from the fire cast uneven shadows across the table, highlighting every scar and groove. Some cuts ran deep enough to trap water, forming tiny puddles that would reflect the flames. The women ignored them, moving their blades carefully around each imperfection.
The act of cooking became a negotiation with the flaws of the surface itself. By the time the meal was done, the table would bear new marks, faintly red at the edges, darker in the center. They would wipe it once more, leaving streaks that glistened in the low light. Then, exhausted, they would place the bread and bowls on the same surface, eating over the ghosts of meals long past. The table's texture told the story of generations, of knives that had dulled, of stains that never faded, of lives that never stopped working. It was never polished, only worn smooth by hands, elbows, and years. Its imperfections weren't hidden. They were accepted like everything else in that world. When the fire dimmed and the room sank into silence, the table stayed behind, holding the smell of the day's work. The faint scent of iron and smoke lingered until the morning, when it would be used again as if nothing had ever happened. The table didn't just hold food, it held time. Every groove was a memory, every stain a story. It was both the stage and the witness to the endless act of feeding life with labor. And as the house settled into sleep, the table stood quietly beneath the fading smoke, waiting for the next cut, the next stain, the next day's proof that survival never paused. Cooking in a medieval kitchen wasn't a science, but an act of memory and instinct. There were no scales to measure weight, no spoons marked with precise numbers. Every recipe existed only in the cook's mind, shaped by experience rather than by instruction. The ingredients were judged by sight, touch, and sometimes sound. Flour was scooped by hand, water was poured until it felt right. Salt was thrown in pinches that were guided by habit. There was no such thing as exactness, only the hope that familiarity would lead to something edible. The cooks learned from watching, not from reading. Mothers taught their daughters by example, repeating the motions until they became second nature. A handful here, a trickle there. It was a language of gestures, not of words. The difference between success and failure could be as small as the width of a finger or the tilt of a wrist. And when the dish failed, there was no complaint, only a quiet acceptance that this time the guess had gone wrong. It's strangely comforting and a little absurd that entire meals depended on something as fragile as a hunch. Flour dust filled the air, settling into their hair and sleeves. It was soft to the touch, but deceptive in its weight. Too much, and the bread became dense and bitter. Too little, and it collapsed into mush. Women knew the texture by feel alone, the way the dough clung or broke, the way it sighed under the pressure of a palm. They judged not with tools, but with years of repetition. Experience replaced precision. Water was added in thin streams, measured by the sound it made when it hit the bowl. The liquid's coolness against their skin told them whether it was enough. There was no thermometer, no clock. Only the senses mattered. Some said the best cooks were those whose hands knew what the recipe wanted before their mind could even think about it. The hands remembered the meals that worked and the ones that didn't. Spices were the greatest gamble. A pinch too little and the food would taste flat. A pinch too much and it would become inedible. Salt, pepper, or herbs were sprinkled in until the smell felt right. Sometimes that rightness meant too much, but there was no way to undo it. Once it was mixed in, the error became a part of the meal. If you compare it to the precision of modern recipes and measuring cups, their method would seem like madness, a dance of uncertainty that was performed every single day around the fire. And yet somehow people survived by it. There were no written recipes hanging on the walls, no books with perfect ratios. The art of cooking lived only in memory and in muscle. When someone died, so did their knowledge. A dish could vanish from a family forever simply because no one had watched closely enough. Words were too weak to capture the feeling of dough or the thickness of stew. They could only be learned by touch, by repetition, by error. Mistakes were constant companions. Some loaves of bread burned at the edges, some stews turned thin and sour. The cooks would adjust as they went, adding a handful of flour or a dash of salt, tasting with the tip of a finger, and then just hoping for the best. There was no guarantee of success, but neither was there a fear of failure. Perfection wasn't expected. Food only needed to be filling. The kitchen smelled of flour and smoke of overboiled water and charred bread. The women worked quietly, trusting their intuition more than anything else. Their tools were crude wooden bowls, stone mortars, and iron spoons that were blackened by the fire. They would stir and mix until the texture felt familiar. That familiarity was their only standard. Some learned to read ingredients like they were reading faces. They could tell when the dough was too dry just by the sound it made when it was kneaded, or when a soup was ready by how it bubbled against the pot. There was no clock to measure time, only the changing rhythm of smell and sound. Cooking wasn't a process. It was a conversation between a person and a flame. I imagine their kitchens as spaces of quiet courage, where every meal was an experiment and every mistake became tomorrow's wisdom. The cooks didn't seek perfection because they couldn't. They sought sustenance, something that would feed the family before the next day of labor began. The lack of tools forced them to trust themselves, and in doing so they became masters of imperfection. Meals would change with their mood and their memory. One day the bread was thick and heavy, the next it was soft and warm. The same ingredients never made the same dish twice. Consistency was a dream they couldn't afford. What mattered was that there was food at all. Hunger didn't demand accuracy, it demanded effort. When guests came, the cooks would add more flour, more herbs, or simply more faith. They had no way to double a recipe except by guessing. Some dishes improved by accident, others failed for the same reason. The family ate them anyway, grateful for the warmth, the fullness, and the familiar imperfections. There was a beauty in the unpredictability. Each meal carried a story, not of mastery, but of endurance. The cooks would laugh when things went wrong, shake their heads, and adjust the next time. They were alchemists of the ordinary, turning guesswork into survival. Their tools may have been simple, but their instincts were sharper than any knife. The meals they made were never quite the same, but they were always theirs. The taste of each dish belonged to a single day, a single moment, never to be repeated again. It was impermanence disguised as tradition. When the fire dimmed and the kitchen fell silent, the smell of flour and salt lingered in the air. The bowls were empty, the hands were tired, the memory of the flavor already fading. But there was always the comfort of knowing that tomorrow, with the same hands and the same guesses, another meal would come to life again. Cooking by instinct was both a gift and a curse. It demanded constant attention, endless patience, and the courage to fail quietly. It wasn't perfection that kept them alive, it was persistence. And as they blew out the last candle, they knew that the next morning would bring another test of their senses, another meal balanced on touch, smell, and trust. Theirs was a world where survival had no recipe, only the steady rhythm of hands that kept trying. Light in a medieval kitchen was a fragile thing. There were no bright bulbs to scatter the shadows, no steady glow to reveal every single detail. The only light came from the narrow windows where the sun would slip through in thin, dusty beams, or from the fire itself, which flickered and changed like a living creature. When the day was cloudy or the air was thick with smoke, the room would sink into a dimness so deep that everything blurred together. The cooks worked in a world of half-seen shapes, their hands moving by memory rather than by sight. In the mornings, the light from the small window was pale and uncertain. Dust would drift through it like a fog, turning every movement slow and careful. A bowl of flour looked the same as a bowl of salt, and a handful of herbs could easily be mistaken for dry leaves. The women would lean in close to the table, squinting, trying to distinguish one thing from another. The effort would make their eyes ache. They learned to trust texture more than color and smell more than appearance. It's almost absurd to think that whole meals depended on how well someone's fingers could tell flour from sugar in the dark. When the clouds covered the sky, the kitchen would become a cave. The fire offered little help. Its light would dance across the walls, too weak to reach the corners and too wild to trust. Shadows would leap with every flicker, making objects appear and disappear. Sometimes the cooks would mistake one jar for another, seasoning the soup with ashes instead of salt, or pouring broth into the dough. They would curse softly, not from anger, but from exhaustion. Each mistake meant more work and more wood burned for nothing. If you compare it to the bright, sterile light of modern kitchens, theirs would seem like another world, a place where cooking was as much about instinct as it was about endurance. The dimness wasn't only an inconvenience, it was a danger. A knife's edge would glimmer faintly in the firelight, but only for a second. A slip of the hand could draw blood before the eye even noticed. Burns were just as common. Reaching toward the pot meant guessing where the handle might be, trusting the memory of where it was last set. Evenings were worse. When the sun sank, the windows would turn black and the fire became the only companion. Its glow was beautiful, but unreliable. The smoke would rise thick and low, curling through the air until it blurred everything even further. The women stirred the pots blindly, guided by sound, the bubbling of the broth, the hiss of the fat, the dull thump of a spoon against the iron. It wasn't sight that told them when the food was ready, but rhythm. The flames carved deep orange shapes across their faces, revealing their exhaustion and their patience. Shadows of pots and ladles would stretch along the stone walls like long, slow-moving ghosts. Every corner of the room seemed to whisper with a quiet life, the crackle of burning wood filling the silence. The darkness was never fully pushed away. It simply retreated just enough to allow for survival. When the wind blew through the cracks, it would make the fire sputter, plunging the kitchen into moments of complete blindness. In those seconds, everything would stop. The hands, the breath, the sound. Then when the flame returned, the work would begin again, as though nothing had happened. That rhythm of light and dark defined their lives, a steady reminder of how fragile control really was. I imagine their patience must have been immense, the kind that grows from having no choice but to adapt to imperfection. They didn't complain about the dimness because there was no alternative. The eyes learned to see differently. The mind learned to fill in what the light couldn't show. The faint glow from the hearth became enough. The kitchen became a world of half-truths, where everything existed in shades rather than in certainty. They knew the fire's behavior as one might know a friend. A steady flame meant safety. A restless one meant trouble. When a log shifted, sparks would fly like tiny stars, and the women would blink against the sudden brightness. Their eyes, used to the dark, would sting with tears, but they kept working. Meals were made slowly, one hesitant motion at a time. In some homes, candles were lit when the fire dimmed, but they burned too quickly to be wasted often. The smell of melted tallow would fill the air, sweet and greasy. The wax would drip onto the table, hardening into pale rivers. Each candle's life was measured carefully. Each flame was an hour that was borrowed from the dark. When it died, the work stopped. No one dared to cook blind. Children grew up in that half-light, their eyes sharper than their elders. They would play near the hearth, learning to move carefully, to respect both the fire and the shadow. The dimness became a part of their comfort, the way silence becomes music when it's all you've ever known. Light wasn't a right, it was a gift, brief and precious. The meals they made under that light were imperfect, uneven, but deeply human. Some parts would burn, and others would remain raw. And yet the family would gather and eat by the same dim glow that had guided the cooking. The shadows made everything softer, more forgiving. In that blur of orange and black, no one noticed the flaws. They tasted the effort, not the precision. When the last embers began to fade, the kitchen fell into near darkness. The smell of smoke lingered like a memory. The women would sit quietly for a moment, their hands resting on the table, the faint warmth of the fire still touching their skin. The world outside was already night, and inside there was nothing left to do but to let the dark reclaim the room. The next morning they would start again, striking flint to spark a new light, coaxing a flame into life with slow, practiced breaths. The first flicker of orange would spill across the same old walls, and once more the day's work would begin in the same soft half-light that had guided generations before them. The darkness wasn't an enemy, it was simply a part of life, something to be endured rather than conquered. Their eyes learned to find a beauty in it. Their hands learned to trust it. And as they stirred the pot one last time before sleep, they must have known that the same faint glow would welcome them again at dawn. Meals in a medieval home weren't served at tables, but on the very ground where life unfolded. The kitchen floor doubled as a dining room, a workshop, and a resting place. There were no chairs arranged neatly, no clean surfaces waiting for plates. Instead, the family would gather in a circle around a pot that was placed directly on the packed earth. The air smelled of smoke, soil, and boiled broth. The heat from the fire would spread unevenly, warming their legs while the rest of the room stayed cold. Eating together meant crouching close, their hands reaching out for the same bowl, their feet brushing against the ashes and crumbs from earlier meals. The ground beneath them was never clean. Dirt and ash would mix with fallen bits of food, pressed down by footsteps until it became a part of the floor itself. When the soup boiled over, droplets would splash onto the soil and just disappear instantly. Dogs or chickens would hover nearby, waiting for scraps to fall. It's strangely funny, in a grim sort of way, that their dining area was shared with their livestock and their dust. The act of eating was less about comfort and more about continuation, a way to fill the stomach before returning to work. There were no separate dishes for each person. The food stayed in the same pot it had been cooked in, placed right between them all. Spoons, when they existed, were passed from one hand to another, wiped only briefly between uses. Often, they just used their fingers, dipping into the same stew, breaking bread together, tearing meat apart with a shared effort. Warmth came not from the fire, but from proximity, from the closeness of their bodies leaning toward the same meal. The fire would burn low beside them, its glow flickering across the floor. The shadows stretched out long, broken by the shapes of bowls and bare feet. The youngest children would sit nearest the pot, their eyes wide and hungry, watching for their turn. The older ones waited patiently, though the smell of meat or grain made their stomachs twist. The rule was simple: eat quickly before the food cooled, because reheating it meant wasting more wood. If you compare it to the image of modern dining rooms with their polished tables and steady light, their way of eating would seem almost primitive. And yet it was ordinary, even comforting to them. The earth beneath them was home, the pot was life, and the act of eating together was a small victory over hunger. The idea of sitting apart, each with their own plate, would have felt strange, even lonely. Dust and ash drifted constantly in the air. When the wind moved through the gaps in the walls, it would carry tiny grains of earth that landed on the food unnoticed. Soot from the smoke would fall into their bowls. No one cared. They had long since stopped worrying about what was clean or pure. The boundary between the meal and the environment had vanished. The ground gave them both their food and their place to eat it. Sometimes a small mat of straw was laid down to soften the earth, but it did little to keep out the damp. The fire's warmth helped, though it left everything coated in soot. When the meal ended, the family would wipe their hands on cloths that smelled faintly of ash and fat. The bowls were rinsed in cold water, and the floor was swept with handfuls of dry grass. The ritual was brief. There was no dining etiquette, only the quiet rhythm of necessity. Children would often play with the remnants of food, drawing shapes in the dust beside the pot. Laughter mixed with the crackling of the firewood. For a moment, the hardship would soften, replaced by the simple comfort of being together. The adults rarely spoke while they were eating. Their focus stayed on the pot, the warmth, the satisfaction of food after a day of labor. I find it quietly moving that for them, eating wasn't a performance of manners, but a humble act of survival that was shared without any shame. The floor was both their table and their history, marked by the traces of countless meals. Each stain, each burn mark, each crumb that was pressed into the soil told the story of persistence, of families who endured without luxury, finding their comfort in the most modest of ways. The room after supper was always the same, the faint glow of the embers, the smell of cooked grain, and the soft sound of someone brushing the floor. The pot remained in the centre, still warm, surrounded by the shadows of those who had eaten. In that circle of dim light, the world seemed small but complete. Hunger was gone, even if it was only for a little while. There was no table to separate them. No distance between the act of cooking and the act of eating. The same fire that boiled their meal also warmed their feet. The same ground that held their pot also held their bodies when they slept. The house was one continuous space of labor, rest, and sustenance. To eat was to live inside the same rhythm that carried them through every single day. When guests came, nothing changed. They simply widened the circle, added more bread, and poured more water into the stew. Hospitality didn't mean abundance. It meant sharing whatever warmth they had. Knees would touch, bowls would pass from hand to hand, and in the soft flicker of the firelight, even strangers became a part of the same survival. As the night deepened, they would lean back on their elbows, full and tired. The fire dimmed, its red glow reflected faintly in the sheen of the pot. The room was quiet except for the occasional crackle of burning wood. Tomorrow they would cook again on the same ground, eat again from the same bowl, and sweep away the same dust that would always return. The earth beneath them was unyielding, and yet it held everything: food, warmth, and family. Their world was small, dark, and rough. But within it, they found a continuity, a comfort that was born not from luxury, but from habit. And as the last ember faded into grey ash, the floor that had fed them turned cold again, waiting for the morning, for the fire, and for the next meal to begin in exactly the same way. Cooking in a medieval kitchen meant working with pain as a constant companion. There were no gloves to protect the skin, no aprons to shield the body, no towels waiting nearby to catch the heat. Every single movement required bare hands against fire, metal, and stone. The act of preparing food was a negotiation between necessity and injury. The pots were hot, the flames were unpredictable, and yet they had to be touched, lifted, and stirred. Each meal demanded a small sacrifice of flesh to the fire. The kitchen itself was a place of hazards. The floor was uneven, slick with spilled fat, and the air was thick with smoke. The women moved through it with a quiet precision, their hands red and cracked from constant use. They would stir soups, turn meat, and lift lids without any hesitation. The heat burned, but they ignored it. It's almost cruelly ironic that their survival depended on touching what constantly hurt them. The skin on their palms grew thick and shiny, blistered in some places, calloused in others, a record of years spent cooking without any safety. Their sleeves were rolled up to the elbow, stained with grease and soot. The fabric of their clothes was rough linen or wool, both flammable and unforgiving. Sparks would jump from the fire onto their skirts, leaving black marks that never fully washed away. Sometimes a spark would catch the edge of an apron, forcing them to slap it out quickly before it could spread. The smell of singed cloth and burnt oil became a part of the kitchen's air, indistinguishable from the scent of the food itself. The pots were made of iron, heavy enough to strain their wrists. Lifting them from the fire required both strength and timing. There were no handles that were designed to stay cool, no cloth mitts to soften the touch. They would use folded rags or even the edges of their skirts to hold the metal, knowing it would burn through anyway. The sizzle of fabric meeting heat was as familiar as the crackle of wood. The burns that followed were minor, expected, and forgotten by the next meal. If you compare it to modern kitchens filled with insulated gloves, heat-proof utensils, and clean aprons, theirs would resemble a forge more than a cooking space, a place where endurance mattered more than comfort. The line between cooking and labor blurred completely. Each blister was a small price for keeping the fire alive. The women learned to use the back of their hands to test the heat, to stir with long wooden spoons that splintered under pressure, to trust instinct over caution. Accidents happened often. Oil would splatter from the pans, leaving dark scars that never faded. Boiling water would spill over their wrists, steam would burn their faces, and yet there was no time to tend to the wounds. A burned hand still had to knead dough. A blistered palm still had to hold the ladle. There were no remedies beyond wrapping the injury in a piece of cloth and continuing the work. Pain wasn't something to avoid, it was a part of the recipe. The air was alive with risk. The open flame would hiss when fat dripped into it, sending sparks upward. The smoke would sting their eyes until tears blurred their vision. Their hair smelled of soot, their arms of oil. They cooked by touch, guided by muscle memory more than sight, because looking away from the fire meant missing the moment before a pot boiled over. Their bodies became the tools that the kitchen lacked. Some women wore makeshift aprons, old rags tied at the waist, but they offered little protection. The fabric would absorb the grease, catching dirt and smoke until it became stiff and heavy. When they leaned too close to the pot, the heat would soak right through it, searing the skin beneath. Over time, their clothes became a patchwork of stains, burns, and repairs. The kitchen left its mark on everything it touched. I can almost feel the rhythm of their movements, quick, efficient, practiced, through countless small injuries. There was no hesitation, no fear of the heat, only a familiarity with pain. They learned to move their hands just fast enough to escape the worst of it, to lift the pots in one fluid motion before the heat could bite too deep. In that balance between precision and endurance, the meals were born. The smell of burning skin wasn't shocking to them. It was ordinary. They recognized the faint singe of their fingertips as easily as they recognized the scent of stew. Their hands were instruments of labor, not decoration. Rings would have been impractical, and long sleeves would have been dangerous. Everything they wore or touched was dictated by survival. Sometimes, while stirring, they would brush against the rim of the pot and flinch quietly, hiding the reaction as if they were embarrassed by it. Pain was private, not something to dwell on. The same hand that was burned one moment would soon be lifting bread from the oven or chopping herbs with a dull knife. The cycle of injury and work was endless, accepted, and invisible. The fire that sustained them also consumed them. It dried their skin, filled their lungs, and etched lines into their faces long before age could. The heat never left the room. It clung to every surface, pressing close even after the fire had died down. They slept with its residue on their skin, its smell in their hair, its memory in their hands. At night, when the cooking was done and the room fell quiet, they would examine their palms in the dim light. The blisters would rise like small moons against the roughness of their skin. They might dip their fingers into a bowl of cool water, sigh softly, and then just let them dry naturally. There was no complaint, no ceremony, only acceptance. Tomorrow the same fire would burn, and the same hands would reach for it again. The kitchen wasn't a place of safety, it was a place of persistence. Each burn, each scar, each torn sleeve told the same story. a life lived in service of warmth and nourishment. They didn't have the luxury to fear what hurt them, only the strength to keep facing it. When morning came, they would start again, rekindling the fire with their cracked fingers, lifting the same heavy pots, and moving with the same practiced care. The body remembered what the tools never could. And as the first hiss of boiling oil filled the air once more, the women of the house stepped closer to the flame, bare-handed and unflinching, ready to serve another day's hunger with the only protection they had: endurance. Cooking over an open flame was both an art and an accident. There were no ovens with doors to close, no iron grates to rest the food on, only the fire itself, wild, bright, and unpredictable. The women would place meat on long skewers made of wood or iron, holding them just above the blaze, turning them slowly by hand. The heat was uneven, rising and fading with every gust of wind. The smoke would curl upward, stinging their eyes as fat dripped from the meat into the flames, sending up sparks that danced like angry insects. The smell was intoxicating, and the danger was constant. The skewers would creak as they heated, bending slightly under the weight. A wrong angle or a moment's distraction meant disaster. The meat could slip right off and vanish into the ash, hissing before it was swallowed by the embers. It's almost ridiculous that a meal could disappear so quickly, undone by gravity and carelessness. And yet it happened often, and when it did, they would say nothing. They would just spear another piece and begin again. The fire was a master that they could not argue with. Some used iron rods instead of wooden ones, but even the metal betrayed them. It grew hot too fast, burning their hands before the meat was even done. They would wrap the handles in rags, though the fabric would smoke and sometimes even catch fire. Cooking became a test of patience and instinct, turning the skewer before the surface blackened, lowering it just enough to cook the inside, and pulling it back when the flames reached too high. There were no thermometers, only the hiss of the fat and the color of the smoke. The smell of roasted meat mixed with soot filled every corner of the room. The fire would crackle, lighting up their faces in flashes of orange. Sweat would bead on their foreheads as they crouched near the flames, trying to guess when the food was ready. Sometimes it would come out charred on the outside and raw within, but they ate it anyway. Perfection was a luxury for people who had choices. If you compare it to the modern comfort of temperature dials and metal racks, their cooking would look more like survival than cuisine, a ritual of risk where the fire decided the outcome. Every meal was a gamble, and every bite was proof that something had gone right by chance. They learned to smell readiness, to listen for the quiet crackle that meant the inside had cooked through. The fire gave no second chances. Once something was burned, it was gone. Fat dripping into the flames would make the fire roar suddenly, forcing them to step back. The burst of heat would sear their faces and they would laugh quietly through the pain. It was all a part of the routine. The fire demanded respect, but it also demanded attention. They couldn't leave it even for a moment. Stirring the soup or turning away to fetch more wood could mean a ruined meal. The rhythm of the flame ruled the kitchen, setting its own pace for everything else. The walls bore the marks of countless fires. Soot would crawl up the stones like black ivy, settling in layers that told the history of every meal that was ever cooked there. The smell of smoke clung to the beams, to their hair, to the very fabric of the home. The air never cleared completely. Even after the fire went out, the ghost of its heat lingered. Burns were common. The wooden skewers would splinter, cutting into their palms. The iron ones would leave small, circular scars where their skin met the heat. But no one complained. They had long since accepted that to feed a family meant to suffer a little bit each day. The fire gave life, but it always demanded something in return. Sometimes the food would fall into the ashes, covered in a grey dust. They would brush it off with the edge of a cloth and eat it anyway. Hunger made dirt invisible. The first bite of something cooked directly over the fire was worth the risk. The crackle of charred skin, the faint bitterness of the smoke, the warmth spreading from the tongue to the chest. It tasted of the world they lived in, harsh, simple, and real. Children would watch from a distance, fascinated by the fire's movement. They learned by observing, not through instruction. One day, the same hands that reached for the skewers in curiosity would hold them with a practiced caution. The knowledge was passed down not through words but through burns and repetition. I find it strangely poetic that their meals carried the same marks as their lives, burnt in some places, raw in others, and yet still enough to keep going. Fire shaped everything it touched, and they accepted it as both an enemy and an ally. Cooking was never predictable. It was a daily bargain between hunger and flame. At night, the embers would glow faintly in the hearth, pulsing like a heartbeat. They would stir them gently before they slept, saving enough warmth to spark the next day's fire. The skewers would lean against the wall, blackened and bent, smelling of smoke and meat. The ashes beneath them would whisper softly, cooling into silence. When dawn came, the cycle would begin again. They would light new flames from the remnants of the old, blow gently until the fire came alive, and once more they would hold their hands near it, feeling for the right distance between heat and hunger. The same skewers, the same scars, the same struggle. The fire never learned mercy, and they never stopped forgiving it. In its light, they would roast another meal, breathe in another cloud of smoke, and watch the sparks rise toward the ceiling like fleeting stars, brief, bright, and gone. And somewhere between the burning wood and the smell of cooked meat, they found the closest thing they had to warmth, both for the body and for the spirit. In a medieval kitchen, fire was both a tool and a temperament. There was no knob to twist, no quick adjustment between a simmer and a boil. The only way to control the heat was by hand, feeding wood to the flames, shifting coals with iron tongs, or pouring water when the fire grew too wild. Every meal began as a conversation with the fire, and the fire did not always listen. Its moods would change with the wind, with the dampness of the wood, with the patience of the person who was tending it. Women would crouch near the hearth, watching the glow like readers studying a language that was written in light. The brightness of the flames, the sound of the crackle, the thickness of the smoke, all of it revealed something. They could tell when the heat was too weak, just by the color of the coals. A pale flame meant hunger. A deep orange meant readiness. It's almost unbelievable that entire meals depended on how well someone could read the color of fire instead of the numbers on a dial. Adding wood meant crouching close to the blaze, sliding small logs into its center. Sparks would burst upward like angry bees biting at their bare skin. Each addition risked either too much or too little. Too much, and the pot would boil over. Too little, and the stew would cool into uselessness. There was no middle ground, only trial and instinct. When the food demanded more heat, they would lean in close, blowing gently to coax the flames higher. Their breath would mingle with the smoke, their faces flushed with the effort. To lower the temperature was even harder. They had to rake the glowing coals aside or pour small amounts of water to tame them. The sound was sharp, a hiss that was like a warning. Steam would rise instantly, curling around their hands and faces, carrying the smell of burnt wood. Sometimes, in their haste, they would scatter ashes onto the food. It didn't matter. Everything already tasted faintly of smoke. If you compare it to the instant precision of modern stoves, their world feels like a test of patience, an existence that was built entirely around waiting for the fire to obey. There were no shortcuts. Once the flame grew too hot, it had to burn itself calm. Once it died, it had to be reborn from the embers. Cooking wasn't about control, but about cooperation. The women didn't command the fire. They courted it, learned its rhythm, and feared its silence. The wood itself was unpredictable. Fresh logs would hiss with moisture, smothering the flame. Old wood would burn too fast, devouring the meal before it was even ready. Each type of tree gave a different heat. Oak burned steadily but slowly. Pine burned brightly but dirtily, and willow filled the air with smoke. Choosing the wood was as important as choosing the ingredients. Mistake the type, and the meal was ruined before it even began. The fire responded to the weather as well. On windy days, it would flicker wildly, spitting sparks onto the floor. On damp mornings, it would sulk, refusing to catch until half the kindling was gone. The women learned to adjust by instinct, their bodies leaning forward or back in a perfect rhythm with the living flame. Their hair smelled perpetually of smoke, their clothes of wood and ash. There was no way to escape it. Keeping the right heat meant constant attention. They couldn't leave the kitchen even for a moment. A child's cry, a knock at the door, a small distraction could undo hours of work. The stew could thicken too much and the bread could harden to a stone. So they stayed, crouched and watchful, turning the logs with long sticks, whispering small prayers that the flame would stay steady. The walls of the kitchen bore witness to their labor. Layers of soot climbed upward, painting everything in shades of brown and black. The air shimmered faintly from the heat. The ground near the hearth was coated in ash, soft beneath their bare feet. It wasn't a place of comfort, but of constant negotiation. I can almost feel the quiet frustration that must have lived in that space, the exhaustion of tending something that refused to be tamed. The fire never truly obeyed. It merely tolerated them. Each meal was a fragile truce between hunger and hazard, a dance that could end in success or ruin with a single careless moment. They learned to trust their senses more than their reason. The sound of bubbling broth told them when the flame was right. The smell of burning fat told them when it was wrong. Their hands would hover near the heat, judging its strength by feel alone. Those who cooked long enough developed a sixth sense for temperature, something that was between skill and survival. When the fire finally settled into a balance, the room would soften, the glow would turn steady, the air warm without violence. In that moment, the women would allow themselves a breath of relief, but the peace never lasted. The wood would burn down to embers, the coals would cool, and the whole process would begin again. The fire was always hungry. At night, they would bury the coals beneath the ashes to preserve them until the morning. The next day, those faint embers would be stirred back to life, coaxed gently into a flame again. The cycle never ended. Light, heat, patience, exhaustion. The hearth was both a comfort and a burden, the one thing that kept them alive and also wore them down in equal measure. To cook was to live beside something that could not be trusted, but could not be lost. The fire was their warmth, their light, their danger, and their proof of endurance. When they finally stepped away from the hearth, their faces would glow faintly, lit by the last orange of the coals. The room smelled of wood smoke and sweat, a mixture that spoke of both struggle and sustenance. And as the final ember dimmed into black, they knew that tomorrow the same flame would test them again, asking once more for their patience, their breath, and their steady, unshakable hands. Making dough in a medieval kitchen was a slow physical struggle. There were no metal mixers humming on the counter, no precise paddles spinning at an even speed. Every batch began with a pile of flour poured directly onto a wooden surface, a crater hollowed out in its center to hold water or milk. The woman would bend over the table, her sleeves rolled up, her hands sinking into the cold, soft powder. The wood beneath was rough, and the air was heavy with dust. The first touch was deceptive. It felt light, even gentle, but soon it would cling to their skin like wet clay. The act of mixing wasn't about technique, it was about endurance. As they folded and pressed, the dough grew heavier, sticking to their fingers, their wrists, and the cracks of the table. There was no escape from it. They had to scrape it away with their nails, peeling it off in thin layers before continuing. Bits of it would dry fast, turning crusty against their skin. It's almost comical how the simple act of preparing bread turned into a small war between a hand and flour. The more they worked, the more stubborn the dough became. It would absorb the heat of their palms, growing warm, elastic, and alive beneath their effort. They judged the mixture entirely by touch. Too dry and the dough would crack. Too wet and it would ooze through their fingers. There was no machine to correct it, no measurement to trust. They relied on instinct and memory, the feeling of resistance under their hands. Each handful of water was poured carefully, guessed rather than measured. Sometimes it was perfect, and sometimes it wasn't, but there was no time to start again. The surface they used was an old wooden board or the table itself, worn smooth in some places and splintered in others. Tiny grains of flour filled every groove, and the wood smelled faintly of yeast and smoke. They would spread flour across it like snow, hoping it would stop the sticking, though it never did completely. The dough would cling to the table with the same stubbornness it had for their hands, a reminder that the kitchen gave nothing freely. If you compare it to the effortless rhythm of modern mixers spinning through clean bowls, their method feels almost primitive, a quiet wrestling match that demanded as much patience as it did strength. They would work in silence, pressing with their palms, folding again and again, until the dough turned smooth enough to breathe on its own. The room would fill with the sound of soft slaps and sighs, the air thick with the scent of flour. The process was slow. The women would shift their weight as they worked, leaning into the dough, their arms trembling from the effort. Sometimes the flour would cloud upward in pale bursts, coating their faces and hair. The fire would flicker behind them, painting everything in gold and grey. They didn't rush, they couldn't. The dough demanded time, and time was something they had learned to surrender. When it was ready, they could tell without even looking. The dough's surface would grow warm and slightly tacky, its shape holding firm under pressure. That was the signal, the quiet reward for their labour. But even then it had to rest, covered with a cloth near the fire, while they cleaned the table with the edge of a knife, scraping off what had dried. Nothing was ever wasted. The scraps were rolled together, kneaded again, and reborn into the next loaf. Their hands bore the proof of their work, red, dry, and dusted with a flour that clung even after washing. Their nails were always white with residue, and their knuckles were cracked. They would rub fat or oil into their palms to soften them at night, though it rarely helped. Each morning, the same skin would meet the same dough again. I find something strangely intimate in the way they touched their food. How every loaf of bread carried the imprint of its maker's hands, the warmth of her skin, the shape of her fatigue. The bread wasn't only sustenance, it was a trace of labour, of repetition, of quiet persistence. The dough would sometimes turn against them. On humid days, it would refuse to rise, lying heavy and lifeless even after hours near the hearth. On dry days, it would split apart before baking. There was no control, only hope. When it failed, they baked it anyway. Waste was a sin the poor could not afford. The bread might be dense, hard, and uneven, but it was still bread. Children would watch their mothers work, mesmerized by the motion of kneading. They learned when to stop by the look of the dough's surface, when to rest it by the sound of the slap. The knowledge was passed from touch to touch, from generation to generation, without a single written word. The recipe lived in their hands, not in books. When the dough was ready for the oven or the firestone, they would lift it gently, almost reverently. It was heavy but alive, a small victory that was earned through patience and strength. The table beneath was coated in a thin film of flour and sweat, the smell of work lingering long after the bread was gone. Even after baking, traces of dough remained wedged in the grooves of the wood. No matter how they scraped, it stayed there like a ghost of the meal that had been. And the next time they began to knead, the same surface, marked by hundreds of loaves, welcomed another. The act of kneading wasn't glamorous or gentle. It was repetition, discipline, and endurance. The bread that emerged carried not perfection, but persistence, the quiet kind that kept families alive through seasons of scarcity. When the last loaf was placed near the fire, they would sit back, their hands resting on their laps, the flour still clinging to them like pale gloves. The table was quiet again, the dough's warmth fading into the air. And in that soft silence, surrounded by the smell of yeast and smoke, they knew that tomorrow the same ritual would begin anew, the same flour, the same wood, the same unspoken trust between a hand and hunger. In the dim light of a medieval kitchen, a woman stood over a pot that never stopped boiling. The soup inside was thick, uneven, and heavy with roots, grains, and bits of meat. Steam rose in slow ribbons curling into the air before disappearing into the smoke-stained rafters. She held a long wooden spoon, rough and dark from years of use, and she stirred without rest. The handle was smooth where her fingers had worn it down, but its weight was still punishing. Each circle of the spoon dragged against the resistance of the thick liquid, slow and deliberate, like turning earth with a shovel. The fire crackled beneath the pot, too fierce one moment and too weak the next. She had to move quickly to keep the food from burning at the bottom, her arm tensing with every single motion. There was no tool to make it easier, no blade to churn the mixture evenly. The soup would thicken faster than she could manage. It feels absurd that something as simple as keeping soup from sticking could become a battle against heat, smoke, and time. Her body swayed with each stir, her shoulders aching, her breath sinking to the rhythm of the spoon scraping against the pot's edge. The pot itself was enormous, made of blackened iron, and suspended over the flames by a chain. The metal absorbed the heat until it would burn to the touch. Every few minutes, she would wipe her forehead with the back of her arm, leaving streaks of soot. The air shimmered with heat, and the smell of onions, bone, and smoke mingled into something that was thick enough to taste. The wooden spoon would creak under the strain, its end warped from years of exposure to the fire. Each time the soup began to settle, she would stir it again. The spoon moved slowly through the mixture, breaking apart the lumps that had formed from flour or oats. There was no uniformity, only patience. She had learned that stopping for even a short moment meant disaster. Burnt patches at the bottom would ruin the flavor for days. The pot was both sustenance and punishment, demanding endless attention. If you were to compare it to the ease of modern kitchens where machines hum quietly, her work feels like a kind of endurance ritual rather than cooking. The weight of the spoon left red marks on her palm, and the heat of the fire reddened her face. And yet, she continued, hour after hour, because the meal depended on it. A single pot often served the entire household, and failure was not an option. When she needed to rest, she would lean on the spoon like a walking stick, her fingers trembling from fatigue. The wooden handle was warm, sticky with steam, and coated in a thin layer of oil from the soup. Her sleeves would cling to her arms, damp with sweat. The sound of the bubbling broth filled the silence, steady and hypnotic. Sometimes, as the fire dimmed, she would use the spoon to shift the coals, keeping the heat alive. It wasn't just a tool for cooking, it was an extension of her body. The soup itself was never smooth. It carried clumps of grain, bits of unground spice, and uneven pieces of meat. Still, it was nourishing, and that was enough. The uneven texture told its own story, one of an imperfection that was shaped by necessity. I can almost feel the slow resignation that came with stirring that pot. How each movement was both a task and a quiet surrender to the life they knew. Children would sometimes hover nearby, drawn by the smell. They would watch her stir, but they didn't dare to approach too close to the heat. When she paused, one of them might take her place for a few minutes, struggling to move the spoon even once around the pot. It always looked easier than it was. The first attempt would end with trembling arms and splashes of soup on the floor. They learned quickly that cooking wasn't softness but labor. To test if the soup was ready, she would dip a small ladle in and taste the surface. The heat burned her tongue more often than not, but it was the only way to know. There were no timers, no thermometers, just instinct. The scent of cooked roots and meat became her guide. When it deepened to something earthy and heavy, she knew it was nearly done. Cleaning came after. The wooden spoon was rinsed in water that was already cloudy from the meal before. Scrubbing only did so much. The surface stayed stained, holding the memory of every pot it had ever touched. The iron pot had to cool before it could be cleaned, its weight demanding 2 hands, even when it was empty. Soot clung to the sides like tar. They never expected it to be spotless, only functional. By night, her hands would smell faintly of broth, no matter how much she washed them. The scent stayed in her hair, her clothes, her skin. The smoke, the salt, the fatigue, everything just blended into one. Still, the soup filled every stomach, warming the house as much as the fire did. It was both exhaustion and comfort in a single pot. When she finally set the spoon down, the fire had quieted to glowing coals. The pot simmered softly, no longer demanding her attention. She would wipe her hands on her apron, leaving pale streaks against the fabric, and then she would exhale. The room was heavy with steam, and for a moment she would simply stand there, feeling her heartbeat slow down. The next day would bring the same rhythm, a new fire, another pot, another spoon, another long day of stirring without a pause. There was no innovation, no relief, only the quiet certainty that this was life as it had always been, measured by the sound of soup against iron and the whisper of wooden spoons against the past. Cooking without instruments meant trusting the body. In a medieval kitchen, there were no thermometers to guide them, no numbers to show safety or precision. Women would lean over bubbling pots, listening to the sound of the boil, smelling the change in the air, and testing with their own tongues. The act was small but dangerous. A single taste too soon could blister the mouth. The pain was brief, sharp, and familiar, a reminder that every meal carried a price. The air was always heavy with steam, thick enough to sting the eyes. They worked close to the fire, their faces flushed red, sweat dripping from their brows into the food they were preparing. The heat was constant, swallowing all other sensations. The pot would hiss, the broth would spit small sparks of boiling fat, and she would lean in carefully, her wooden spoon trembling in her hand. She would lift it to her lips, blow gently, and then test. The flavor came mixed with pain. Sometimes it was only warm. Other times it would burn deep enough to make her wince. It feels almost absurd that tasting food could become a daily hazard. But in those kitchens, risk was as common as salt. There were other ways to guess the heat, though none were reliable. The bubbling told stories. Soft ripples meant warmth. Rolling waves meant danger. They would watch how the liquid moved, how the steam lifted from the surface. A quiet hiss meant patience. A loud one meant trouble. Muffled sounds meant something thick was forming at the bottom, and it was soon to burn. The sense of hearing became a tool as vital as any instrument. Smell came next. They learned to recognize the scent of half-cooked grain, of undone meat, of burning fat. It was an art that required years of failure. Some could tell when a dish was ready by the scent alone, though most still needed to risk a taste. Compared to modern kitchens filled with dials, timers, and sensors, theirs was a theater of instinct, where survival itself played the role of technology. The kitchen walls were blackened from years of smoke. The firelight would flicker across the pots, the knives, and the damp stones. The cooks moved slowly, not from laziness, but from calculation. Every step that was too fast meant heat that was too near. Every breath that was too deep meant smoke in the lungs. Testing food was a ritual that was repeated 100 times a day. The same spoon would be dipped into stew, porridge, or sauce, and wiped clean with the corner of an apron before the next taste. Hygiene was a luxury that no one expected. The wooden spoon, smooth and darkened by age, carried the flavor of 1,000 meals. Sometimes, to test food faster, they would simply dip a finger and touch it to their lips. The burns were immediate. Their lips would crack from the heat. Their tongues would be numbed, but the work never paused. The cooks were expected to serve, not to complain. The proof of readiness came from pain. Inside every medieval kitchen, learning to read the heat was a lifelong skill. Too little, and the food would spoil. Too much, and it was ruined. There was no middle ground, no warning, no beeping sound to tell them when to stop. It was experience and memory alone. They would judge meat by how it felt beneath the knife, by how the bones separated from the flesh, by how the fat bubbled at the edge. They learned to look for subtle signs, the shimmer on a surface, the change of smell from raw to cooked. The danger didn't stop with the mouth. Some dishes had to be tasted while they were still boiling. If it cooled for too long, it would thicken or curdle. That urgency forced the cook to risk burns again and again, trusting their instinct to protect them. Their tongues grew accustomed to the heat. The small scars inside their mouths were invisible, but every one of them told a story of practice, of repetition, of survival. It wasn't uncommon for the first bite to scald and the second to taste of ash. The food varied wildly in quality. Some portions were undercooked, chewy and cold at the center. Others would burn black at the edges. A single pot could contain both. Consistency was a modern invention. Theirs was a world where food was an act of faith. Faith in touch, in scent, and in the body's endurance. There is something quietly admirable in that kind of trust, a relationship between the cook and the fire that feels both intimate and unforgiving. She learned to read the room as much as the meal, the temperature of the air, the rhythm of the crackling wood, the way the steam drifted. The senses became a compass. Without them, everything would fall apart. After tasting, she might hand the spoon to another, a silent question of approval. Each cook had her own threshold for pain and for flavor. A burnt tongue didn't excuse an undercooked stew. Perfection was demanded without the tools to achieve it. Failure was scolded but never explained, so they relied on trial day after day until the knowledge lived in their muscles. When the meal was done, they would taste once more before serving, not for enjoyment, but for confirmation. That final taste was both proof and relief. If the tongue burned again, it didn't matter. The food was ready, and that was enough. Later, while cleaning the pot and scraping the ashes, they would run their tongues over the tender skin inside their mouths, feeling the sting as a reminder of the work behind each meal. By night, the air in the kitchen would cool, but it carried the same scent of char and broth. The fires would dim to embers, the pots would turn black with soot. She would hang the spoon near the wall where the shadows made it a part of the darkness. Another day had passed without measure or certainty, but with enough food to quiet the hunger. That was victory in its simplest form. In those kitchens, the tongue replaced the thermometer, the ear replaced the timer, and the nose replaced the gauge. Every sense worked where tools did not exist, shaping a fragile balance between human instinct and heat. They cooked not with precision, but with survival itself. The next morning, as the smoke rose again from the hearth, the same lesson was waiting to be repeated. A mouth ready to taste, a fire ready to burn, and a world where knowing the right moment meant trusting only what you could feel. The air inside a medieval kitchen was never truly dry. Moisture clung to every surface, settling on the beams, the tables, and the stones beneath their feet. The walls would sweat in silence. The wood grew dark with the damp, and the smell of mold mixed with the smoke in a way that never fully left. Every corner felt soft and slick, and the floor, made of worn planks or packed earth, would glisten faintly under the dim light of the fire. There was no air moving, no wind to clear the space, only the steady breath of heat and steam that built up from hours of boiling and roasting. The cooks moved carefully, used to the feel of slipperiness beneath their bare feet or their thin shoes. Each step had to be deliberate, especially near the hearth, where the floor grew coated in fat and soot. Water from washing would splash from the basins and buckets and gather in shallow pools that never dried. It would soak into the wood, making it swell and warp. Mold would spread quietly in streaks of green and black, forming patterns that no one bothered to scrub away anymore. It seems almost laughable to imagine such a place being called a kitchen when it behaved more like a swamp that was trapped inside a house. The air itself was heavy and stubborn. The smoke had nowhere to go, and the steam from the boiling pots would join it in slow spirals that blurred the outlines of everything. The windows, if they existed at all, were small and clouded with grime. The combination of moisture and ash made the room feel as if it was breathing, a living thing that exhaled rot and old air. When the fire went out, the damp would creep back in with double the force, settling on the metal and the fabric, coating everything in a faint sheen that never disappeared. The wooden tools absorbed it the most. Spoons, bowls, and handles would darken over time, their surfaces softening until splinters would break away at the touch. When they weren't being used, they were hung near the hearth to dry, but even the heat couldn't undo what the constant moisture had done. The smell of old wood mixed with grease became a part of every meal. To live with it was to stop noticing it altogether. If you compare this to a modern kitchen where a fan hums quietly to clear the air, these medieval rooms feel like suffocating lungs that never learn to exhale. The food scraps made it worse. There was no sealed disposal, no proper cleaning system. Bits of grain, meat, or fat would slip between the cracks in the floorboards and stay there, softening, rotting, and attracting whatever lived in the shadows. Rats thrived, their small shapes darting along the edges of the walls, silent until nightfall. When the kitchen grew louder with their scurrying, Cockroaches would cling to the corners, moving toward anything that glistened. The cooks, tired and resigned, would shoo them away with their wooden spoons, but they never believed they could be rid of them. When they cooked, drops of broth and grease would fall constantly, marking the floor with spots that deepened into stains. Ash from the fire would settle over everything, turning the damp wood grey. The combination of soot and moisture made the surfaces slick as oil. More than one cook had slipped near the fire, spilling boiling food or burning their arms. It was a place that punished haste, demanding slow movement and constant balance. Sometimes they would try to air out the room. The door would be left open, and the wind, when it came, would rush in for a moment, carrying a breath of relief before dying out again. The brief dryness that followed was almost intoxicating, but within an hour the air would grow thick once more. The heat from the cooking fires would make the moisture rise from the ground, feeding the same endless cycle. The smell was unforgettable. It wasn't only the rot of damp wood, but the mingling of wet ash, spoiled fat, and the mold that lived inside the walls. The odor would seep into their clothes, their hair, and their skin. Even outside the kitchen, the scent would follow them, faint but permanent. I imagine that kind of heaviness, how it must have felt to wake up each morning and step into a room that already seemed to breathe against your skin, damp and alive. Cooking in such air meant fighting against decay every single day. The iron pots would rust faster, the knives would dull under the constant contact with moisture, and the ropes that were holding the kitchen tools would grow soft and frayed. Even the ceiling would drip sometimes, drops falling from the beams onto the food, unnoticed in the steam. Nothing stayed new for long. Everything aged quickly, swallowed by the dampness that the cooks could never truly banish. After cooking, cleaning became another struggle. Without a place for the water to drain, they would carry buckets outside, spilling trails along the way. The ground around the kitchen would stay muddy year-round, feeding the same moisture that always found its way back inside. When the utensils were washed, they were placed near the fire to dry. But if they were left overnight, they would grow a thin, white film of mold by morning. The fight was endless, quiet, and accepted as a part of life. Some households would scatter herbs around the room, rosemary, sage, or thyme, to try and mask the smell. Others would burn bits of resin or dried flowers in small clay bowls, hoping to purify the air. The scents would fade quickly, swallowed by the steam and the smoke. The damp air made everything wilt before its time, from the herbs to the bread to the people. It wore down not just the wood and metal, but their patience itself. By night, when the fire finally went cold, the kitchen would grow silent, but never restful. The air would cool, but the damp would grow stronger, clinging to everything that was left behind. The silence was broken only by a faint scratching from behind the walls, small lives surviving off the crumbs that had fallen during the day. In the dark, the smell would thicken until it was almost tangible. It was the smell of work, decay, and endurance, all mixed together. The cook would sleep knowing the same routine awaited them. The same air, the same floor, the same slow decay hidden beneath the surface of their meals. They had no fan to clear the air, no light to chase away the gloom, no dryness to call clean. The kitchen, like the people inside it, learned to live with the damp, the smell of mold, the squeak of rats, the slickness of the floor. All of them were constants that shaped how they moved and how they lived. It was a world where the fight against rot was lost daily, only to begin again each dawn. The room stayed alive with moisture, an unending reminder that even in the heart of warmth and fire, a cold dampness could still win. In the still, grey light of morning, before the sun had even lifted above the thatched rooftops, a woman would step outside to begin the meal, that wouldn't be ready until noon. There were no shelves lined with jars or packages, no bottles of sauce just waiting to be opened. Every single taste, every texture had to be made from nothing. The day's work began with gathering, pulling vegetables from the damp soil, shaking the dirt from their roots and cutting the outer leaves that had begun to rot. Behind her, smoke would drift from the kitchen, not yet alive with flame, but already heavy with the smell of yesterday's ashes. Each meal was built from fragments of effort. The grain had to be ground by hand, the mortar and pestle echoing like a slow heartbeat in the house. The rhythm of crushing and sifting would fill the air long before breakfast. The flour wasn't the smooth white dust that we know today, but coarse, uneven, and flecked with pieces of husk. She would mix it with water that was drawn from a well that was always too cold, her fingers stiff from the contact with it. It feels strangely exhausting to think that what we now do in minutes once took the better part of a day. The work never paused. Meat wasn't something you just bought. It was an act. A chicken would be caught, its neck twisted, its feathers plucked, and its body cleaned with water that was drawn and boiled just for that purpose. The smell of wet feathers would fill the kitchen, sharp and bitter. Fat would pop in the pan as the fire began to burn strongly enough to cook. The same knife that was used to carve wood or scrape hides would now be used to cut through flesh. Every single stage left its mark on her hands, raw and red. Spices were rare, and when she had them, they came as dry roots or bark that had to be shaved or pounded into a powder. Salt was precious, often damp from storage and clumped together like small stones. It was crushed on the same board that was used for chopping and mixed with herbs that were gathered from outside. Sometimes she would add a pinch of ash to preserve the meat, an old trick that was passed down by those who had little else. The flavors that resulted were never consistent, only familiar in their roughness. The kitchen was alive with small sounds, the scrape of knives, the crack of firewood, the thud of heavy grain on stone. There was no silence, but there was no speech either, just work. She would move between tasks without a thought, her mind pacing alongside her hands. The hours would dissolve quietly. By midday, the air would turn thick with heat and the smell of broth and smoke. The walls would glisten with moisture, and sweat would run from her neck into her collar. Compared to the ease of modern life, where a meal can appear at the press of a button, their world seems almost impossible, a choreography of labor without any rest. And yet it was also a kind of order. Each task followed the next, small and endless, connecting one day to the other like beads on a string. Food wasn't just something to eat. It was survival, shaped by rhythm, repetition, and memory. Grinding grain took longer in the winter when the cold made everything harder. Kneading dough by hand was slow work that demanded strength. The dough would cling to the skin and dry there, pulling with every motion. Washing vegetables meant crouching near a bucket, rinsing again and again until the water no longer turned brown. Sometimes the bucket would freeze over before the task was even done. Meals were rarely simple. Soups required bones to be cracked, the marrow drawn out and boiled until it was cloudy. Bread demanded time to rise, and waiting was a part of the process. Nothing could be rushed because nature allowed no shortcuts. The fire had to be coaxed to life, tended constantly and protected from drafts. If it died, everything stopped. The food, when it was finally ready, was heavy and plain. But every bite carried the memory of the work, the weight of the mortar, the ache of the shoulders, the sting of the smoke in the eyes. The first taste was less about pleasure and more about relief. Warmth and nourishment came from labor, not from luxury. Even the children knew to value it, for they had seen how much effort it took to fill a pot. Sometimes she would trade with her neighbors, salt for flour, herbs for grain. It was the closest thing to convenience that they knew. The idea of opening a jar, pouring a sauce, or sprinkling on some ready-made seasoning would have seemed almost magical. Food was personal, bound to the land and to the body. It was never the same twice because neither the fire nor the hand that was shaping it ever moved in the same way again. I think there was a kind of honesty in that exhaustion. A meal tasted of everything it had cost, the time, the energy, the mistakes, the pain. There was no illusion of ease. To eat was to acknowledge the day's labor, to feel its texture on your tongue. Nothing was hidden. As the day faded, the tools would be washed in cold water, and the scraps would be fed to the animals or buried in the soil. The smell of cooking would linger in her hair and her clothes, mixing with the faint scent of smoke. Tomorrow would bring the same cycle: gather, grind, boil, wait. The kitchen didn't rest, it only paused long enough for sleep. Outside, the night fell and the fire in the hearth burned low. The woman sat for a moment, her hands motionless for the first time all day. The sound of insects replaced the rhythm of the grinding grain. In that silence, there was a satisfaction, brief and quiet, born not from abundance but from completion. Each meal told the same story. Nothing existed until it was made. Nothing lasted unless it was worked for. There was no convenience, no preservation, only the fragile balance between effort and hunger. The scent of the evening meal would drift through the house, a mix of wood, fat, and steam. Tomorrow it would begin again, from the same soil, the same water, the same hands. After the fire went out and the last meal was eaten, the work was still not done. The pots, bowls, and spoons lay scattered around the hearth, coated in layers of grease and soot. The air that had once smelled of cooking now carried the sour scent of cooling fat. Water for washing had to be fetched again, drawn from a well that reflected no light, only darkness. There was no warmth left in the room. The night air would creep in through the cracks, and her breath would turn white as she filled the basin. The first touch of the water was brutal. It stung her fingers, numbing them within seconds, but she continued. The same water was used again and again, each dip turning it darker. The top would shimmer with a thin film of oil, the surface broken by floating bits of ash and crumbs. Still it was precious. To throw it away after one wash would have been wasteful. It feels almost cruel that what we now consider the easiest task was once a test of endurance and pain. She would place a heavy iron pot into the basin. Its surface was blackened from the fire, rough under her touch. There were no soaps, only sand, ash, or small stones to scrape the grease away. She would rub until her hands ached, the sound of metal against grit filling the silence. Bits of burnt food would cling stubbornly, leaving stains that never truly faded. Every dish carried the traces of meals that had come before. Clean wasn't spotless, it was simply less dirty than before. When the water grew too dark to see through, she would pour it outside and refill the basin with what little remained. The process would repeat endlessly, each rinse only half effective. Grease would cling to her wrists, the smell of smoke mixed with the cold earth. The floor was already slick from earlier spills, and her feet would leave faint prints on the damp boards. The entire room felt as if it exhaled fatigue. The small knives and wooden spoons were the easiest to wash, though they still carried the faint scent of every broth and stew they had ever touched. The wooden bowls would absorb the moisture, growing soft, their color darkening each time. The rough surface of the stone basin would scratch her skin, leaving small cuts along her fingers, but she kept working, moving in a slow rhythm, as if each scrape of the dish was a step towards silence. If we compare this to the hum of a modern dishwasher, the contrast feels almost unbelievable. One world runs on patience, the other on electricity. And yet for her, patience was all she had. She washed not only the dishes, but the day itself, stripping away the soot and the effort that clung to everything. The cold water bit deeper into her hands as the night stretched on longer. But she didn't stop until each tool had been rinsed, stacked, and left to dry by the dying fire. The last step was drying, done by hand as well. There were no cloths that were soft enough to absorb the water, only old fabric that was worn thin by years of use. She would wipe what she could, knowing that most of it would remain damp until the morning. The kitchen smelled faintly cleaner, but never fresh. The air carried the same heavy dampness that lived in every single corner. When the washing was over, her hands were red and swollen, the skin rough with cracks. She would rub them together for warmth, blowing gently to bring the feeling back. The kitchen was silent, except for the slow drip of water from the pots that were hung above the hearth. It was a sound that was both soothing and relentless, a reminder that even rest came with work. Sometimes she would linger by the basin after she had finished, staring at her reflection in the murky water. The faint flicker of the fire would dance across its surface, breaking her image into ripples. For a moment, she would see not herself, but every woman who had done the same thing before her, washing in the same cold silence, fighting the same endless dirt. I find something deeply human in that repetition, the quiet dignity of those who found peace in a task that never truly ended. The room grew darker as the fire died. Shadows would stretch along the floor, and the last traces of warmth slipped away. She would wipe her hands on her apron, leaving faint marks that would dry into grey patches by morning. The dishes gleamed weakly in the flickering light, clean enough to begin again tomorrow. There was no luxury of comfort waiting beyond the kitchen. Her bed was near the wall, covered with a coarse linen that smelled faintly of smoke. Her fingers still tingled from the cold as she lay down, her muscles aching from a day that had no clear beginning or end. The quiet was deep, almost heavy, but for the first time all day, it carried no labor. In that stillness, the world outside slept, and so did she. The kitchen would wake again with the first light, ready to repeat its cycle of heat, noise, and work. The dishes would get dirty again, the water would turn dark again, and she would wash them all away once more. That was how life remained steady, through the rhythm of tasks that never changed. The fire had gone out completely now, leaving the room in silence. Only the faint scent of wet iron and wood lingered, mingling with the chill of the night. It wasn't comfort, but it was familiar. And in that familiarity, there was rest. She closed her eyes, her breath soft and even, the ache in her hands fading slowly. The day's noise was gone. What remained was quiet, and in that quiet, something close to peace. Thank you for listening until the end. History is sometimes just the sound of spoons on pots and steam rising in the kitchen. May you sleep peacefully amidst the old stories of the Middle Ages. Good night.